Tonight, we're stepping into a world of quiet horror and quiet rooms. The kind with stone walls, a flickering candle, and a man pacing slowly with blood on his sleeves. Not a murderer, a doctor, but in the Middle Ages, that didn't mean much. If you were sick, desperate, or dying, he was the one they called. He might arrive with a sack of herbs, or a knife, or a jar of leeches. He'd speak in Latin, he'd smell like vinegar, and most of the time, he had no idea what he was doing. This is the story of why it really sucked to be a medieval doctor, and somehow, even worse to need one. We'll walk through cold monasteries, plague-ridden cities, smoky peasant homes, and strange rituals involving moon phases, dead animals, and the color of your urine. But don't worry, we'll take it slow. If this sounds like your kind of strange, sleepy history, take a second to like the video, subscribe for more, and share it with someone who also finds weird comfort in ancient mistakes. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from tonight, and what time is it for you? Now dim the lights, and let's begin. The Bleeding Bowl. The bowl was always cold, made of brass or pewter, sometimes even clay, but no matter the material, it gleamed dully in the candlelight, waiting patiently for blood. This was the tool of the trade. Not the stethoscope, not the thermometer, the bleeding bowl. In the medieval world, most illnesses came down to an imbalance. The four humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, were thought to rule the body like unpredictable kings. If you had a fever, they said you had too much blood, too much energy, too much pressure inside. And so, naturally, the solution was to let some out. Doctors would tie a bit of linen above the patient's elbow, just tight enough to raise the veins. The knife, called a fleam, was curved like a cruel little smile, and with one quick movement, the skin was split. The blood ran fast at first, sometimes slow, and the bowl would fill, dark and steaming. They believed this released the sickness, that the blood carried something bad, something hot, something misaligned, and if you could just drain it, the body would remember how to heal itself. Sometimes it worked, sometimes the fever broke, not because of the bloodletting, but in spite of it, and that was enough. Enough for the doctor to nod quietly, clean his blade on a cloth, and be paid in bread, or eggs, or maybe a single coin. Other times, the patient grew pale, their lips turned blue, they slipped into unconsciousness, and still the doctor might reach for the bowl again, because the logic said, if they're worse, more blood must be the answer. There were no charts, no tests, only tradition, whispers, and faith. The bowl itself was rarely washed, sometimes rinsed, often reused. It would sit in a leather bag alongside leeches, ointments made of goose fat, and packets of dried herbs tied with string. The doctor carried it with him everywhere, from cottages to castles, from fields to firesides. He bled men and women, children, monks, even lords, not always with cruelty, sometimes with hope, other times with indifference, but always, always, the bowl waited. Four humours, no answers. The air in the room was still. A sick child lay on a straw mattress, cheeks flushed with fever. The doctor crouched nearby, his fingers gently pressing the boy's wrist, not for pulse. They didn't do that yet, but for warmth, moisture, maybe a tremble. Then he looked up, murmured a few words and said something strange. His black bile is rising. To us that means nothing. To them it meant everything. The body, they believed, was ruled by four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, each tied to an element: air, water, fire, earth, each with its own personality, each one always trying to stay in balance. When something went wrong, the humours had fallen out of harmony. That was the explanation, and it made perfect sense, to everyone from the poorest shepherd to the most learned monk. You weren't just sick, you were too wet, or too dry, too cold, or too hot on the inside. If you were sluggish, pale, and quiet, your black bile was in excess. The cure? Maybe something warming, a mustard plaster, a hot soup, or a potion made from crushed beetles. If you were feverish and restless, it was too much yellow bile, so they cooled you with cold baths, sour drinks, or bleeding. If you had a cough, too much phlegm, sneezing, headaches, maybe the phlegm had risen into your brain. And if you were full of energy, laughing too much, that was too much blood, which meant it was time again for the bleeding bowl. It sounds absurd, but it gave order to chaos. It made people feel like illness had rules. like the body was a garden that could be tended with the right combinations of heat, cold, wet, and dry. And so, doctors studied it for centuries. Learned men wrote books on the temperament of blood, treatises on how certain foods could warm or cool the body. Tomatoes, by the way, hadn't arrived yet, but garlic was warming, cabbage was cooling, ale could do both, depending on the time of year. You can almost imagine it. A sick woman with aching joints sits by the fire. The doctor opens his satchel, takes out a wax tablet. He scribbles with a stylus, too cold, too wet, then prescribes roasted onions, leeches, and a hot stone for her back. Did it work? Sometimes, sometimes not. But it gave them comfort. And sometimes, in the Middle Ages, that was the closest thing they had to healing. Leeches in the pantry. There's something unsettling about the way leeches move, silent, slow, almost thoughtful. They writhe just slightly, waiting for warmth. And in a damp little jar beneath the doctor's bed, a dozen of them pressed gently against the glass. These were not pets. They were tools. Living, squirming, hungry tools. Used to pull blood from places a knife couldn't reach. When the bleeding bowl was too risky, or the patient too frail, the doctor would reach for the leeches. He kept them in old pottery, or even in flasks, once used for beer, and he always made sure they stayed cool and wet, usually in the corner of the pantry, between dried herbs and strips of salted meat. They were gathered from slow-moving rivers, usually by women wading in skirts, who let the leeches bite their ankles so they could collect them more easily. It wasn't considered cruel, it was just a job, like gathering eggs or cutting peat. To use one, the doctor would pinch it gently between his fingers, then place it just below the skin, often under the ear, on the neck, or behind the knee, places with thin flesh and steady blood. The leech would bite, its tiny jaws would saw through the skin, and then it would drink, quietly, patiently, sometimes for half an hour, sometimes more. When it had its fill, it would let go, heavy now, glossy, almost content. Doctors believed this process helped balance the humors without shocking the system. It was like a whisper compared to the shout of a blade. For fevers, swelling, nosebleeds, eye infections, or headaches, leeches were the go-to. They even used them on children. And once the leech fell away, they'd sprinkle a little ash over the wound, maybe say a prayer, then return the leech to its jar. Some doctors reused them, others threw them into the fire, some fed them goat's milk to keep them strong. It all depended on where you lived, and how much the patient could pay. There's something strange about it, isn't there? To put your hope in something so small, so cold, so ancient. But in a time when pain had no explanation, and healing had no certainty, a jar of leeches might be the most trusted thing in a doctor's care. And when he walked the muddy path from house to house, when the night was still, and the only sound was the slosh of the jar in his pack, he sometimes wondered which patient would need them next. The barber with a saw? You might think of barbers as cheerful men who chat while trimming beards, but in the Middle Ages, a barber was something else entirely. Yes, he cut hair, yes, he shaved faces, but hanging beside his shears was a saw, a bone saw, sometimes rusted, sometimes sharp, and if you needed surgery, real, cutting, screaming surgery, it wasn't the doctor you called, it was the barber. They were called barber surgeons, and they were the closest thing to a field medic that medieval people had. Doctors studied books, whispered Latin, and avoided blood when they could. Barbers, they rolled up their sleeves, they amputated, they pulled teeth, they lanced boils, and sometimes they did it all in the same afternoon. They learned not from universities, but from other barbers. Apprentices stood by and watched, then practiced on pigs, then people. Their tools were kept in wooden cases lined with scraps of wool, a knife for slicing, a saw for bone, a red-hot iron for sealing the wound. Anesthesia? Not quite. Sometimes strong ale, sometimes a bit of opium, if you could afford it. Mostly, just a strong arm, to hold the patient still. There were no clean rooms, no sterilized gloves, no knowledge of infection, just a man with a blade, a cloth, and hope that the bleeding would stop before the soul slipped out. You might see a barber surgeon on market day, under a red-striped tent, demonstrating a tooth pulling or showing off jars of preserved oddities, a tumor, a gallstone, even a severed finger, kept in spirits. His hands were usually stained, with blood, with smoke, with salve, and yet, people trusted him, because in a world full of pain, you turned to the person who was willing to do something about it. even if it meant losing a limb to save a life. The red and white striped pole outside the barber shop, that comes from them. Red for blood, white for bandages, spinning in the wind, like the memory of 1,000 crude operations. And when night fell, and the sore was cleaned, or at least wiped down, the barber might sit by the fire, sip weak beer, and listen to the groans of someone healing in the next room. He had done what he could. That was all anyone could do. A doctor's first corpse. It always happened eventually. No matter how careful, no matter how confident, every medieval doctor had a moment they couldn't forget. The moment when the patient stopped breathing, the room went silent, and there was nothing left to do but fold the hands and close the eyes. The first corpse. He may have started the visit full of belief in humours, in herbs, in prayer. He may have spoken in a steady voice, washed his hands in vinegar, even whispered a charm under his breath. But when the fever didn't break, when the convulsions came, when the skin turned cold, it was already done. There were no monitors, no charts, just the sound of shallow breath, and then none. The doctor would sit back, stare at the floor, and wait for the mother or husband or child to realize it before he had to say the words. He wouldn't cry. He couldn't, because death wasn't rare. It was expected. Even in the best houses, the cleanest towns, the most expensive beds, people died from coughs, burns, childbirth, toothaches, and sometimes from the doctor himself. He might wonder if he'd done something wrong. Too much bleeding, too little, was the liverwort not fresh? Had he placed the leech too close to the heart? There was no one to ask, no one who truly knew. So he packed his tools, left 2 coins on the table, one for the ferryman, they used to say, and walked out without a word. Sometimes he remembered their name, sometimes he didn't, but the first death stuck with him, not for the blood, not even for the silence afterward, but because it reminded him he was guessing, always guessing. And the bowl, the leeches, the sores, the herbs, they were not cures, they were just what he had. Whispers in the plague ward. The door creaked open, and the smell hit first. Sweat, something thick in the air, like damp cloth left too long in a dark place. And under it all, silence, not the peaceful kind, the kind that comes when no one has the strength to speak. This was the plague ward. It wasn't always a real ward, sometimes just an abandoned church, a barn, a row of shuttered cottages on the edge of town, anywhere they could place the sick far from the living. The doctor entered with a mask, not for protection, they didn't understand germs, but for the smell. The long beak was stuffed with herbs, spices, vinegar-soaked sponges, cloves, roses, mint, things they hoped would filter the air, or maybe confuse the disease into passing him by. His coat was waxed, his stick long, not to strike the sick, but to poke, prod, lift blankets without touching. Inside, the patients barely moved. A woman curled under a torn blanket, eyes open, unblinking. A boy muttered nonsense, shivering despite the heat. In the corner, someone prayed in a language even the doctor didn't recognize. They all had the same signs: black swellings under the arms, boils at the neck, dry, gasping breath. Some bled from the gums, some stared blankly at the ceiling, some whispered things that made no sense. Things about death walking the streets, cloaked in bells. The doctor moved quietly. He knew there was little he could do. He might try dried fig syrup, or poultices made with crushed sage and butter. He might cut open the buboes to let the badness drain out. But mostly, he listened, he watched, he bore witness. And when he left, if he left, he did so alone. He scrubbed his hands with vinegar, removed his mask slowly, and looked at the sun as though he hadn't seen it in days. He wouldn't write anything down. There were no reports, only memory, and the quiet knowledge that he would be called again tomorrow, and maybe not return. How garlic became medicine. It started with a bulb, small, pale, pulled from the earth with dirt still clinging to its roots. Garlic, to us, it's seasoning. To them it was a weapon, against sickness, against spirits, against the unseen forces that twisted the body into suffering. The medieval doctor didn't have antibiotics. He didn't understand bacteria, but he did understand garlic. And not just for flavor. They said it was warming, that it opened the body's passages, that it chased away bad airs. those invisible poisonous mists believed to cause everything from coughs to plague. Garlic was crushed into pastes and rubbed on boils, boiled into broths and poured down weak throats, stuffed into shoes to treat frostbite, wrapped in cloth and worn around the neck during outbreaks. If a wound festered, garlic was packed inside. If a fever wouldn't break, they might press it against the skin until it burned. In some towns, it was hung above the door, not to keep out vampires, that legend came later, but to ward off disease itself, as if sickness could be tricked by a smell, and strangely, sometimes it worked. Garlic does have natural antiseptic properties. It can fight certain bacteria, but the doctors didn't know that. To them, garlic was holy, earthy, reliable, a piece of nature that seemed to care. It grew in poor soil, kept well in storage, and it was one of the few things that cost nothing, but gave hope. There's something beautiful in that. A man with no medicine, no microscope, no map of the body, still finding a way to help, with plants, with warmth, with intention. And so the doctor would dry cloves above his hearth, slice them with his bone-handled knife, and pack them in his satchel next to leeches, chalk, and bits of string, because sometimes garlic was the closest thing he had to a miracle. Boils, puss, and prayers. Somewhere behind the monastery, in a shadowed stone room with no windows, a boy sits on a stool. He doesn't speak. He can't. Not through the pain. There's a swelling under his arm. Hard, hot, dark like a bruise, but raised like a blister. The doctor leans close. He doesn't flinch. He's seen worse. Boils were common, sometimes small and harmless. Other times, a sign of something darker. Plague, blood poisoning, a body that was turning against itself. And yet, the treatment was always the same. Wait, warm, pray, then cut. The doctor takes a bit of wool soaked in wine, not for the wound, for the blade. He sets the tip of his knife in the fire, waits for it to glow dull red, and with one breath, he pierces the boil. The skin parts. Thick yellow pus spills out. Hot, sharp smelling, sticky. He doesn't react, just presses a cloth to the wound, lets it drain, listens to the boy gasp softly, then goes still. Pus was seen as a sign, good or bad depending on the color, the smell, the amount. Too little, and the sickness was hidden. Too much, and the body was losing itself. Doctors kept notes, drew little diagrams of boils, compared one case to another, always guessing, always hoping they were right. Some believed the pus carried sin, that illness was the body purging something deeper, and so the doctor might whisper a prayer while he worked, not just for healing, but for forgiveness. He'd crush herbs and press them into the wound, bind it with linen, mark the date in a book, and then leave quietly, because in that time, and in that world, a boil wasn't just a boil. It was a message, a warning, a test of patience and pain, and for the doctor, it was just another step in a long, uncertain walk, through bodies, through guesses, through faith, always towards something he couldn't quite name. The midwife knew more. The doctor arrived late. The sun had long since set, and the cottage glowed with a dim orange flicker from a single oil lamp. But before he could knock, he heard her voice inside. Firm, calm, not afraid. The midwife was already there. In many villages, she had no formal title, no certificate, just the knowledge passed down from hands, from mothers, from watching 100 births and surviving most of them. She wasn't trained like the doctor. She didn't speak Latin. She didn't own a bleeding bowl. But when it came to childbirth, fevers, women's pains, and quiet emergencies that began with a whisper, she was the one people called, and often, she knew more than the doctor did. She carried strange tools, a length of clean thread, a pouch of dried herbs, a wooden spoon to bite during pain, and always, a voice that could steady even the most frightened breath. She used raspberry leaf tea for bleeding, chamomile for cramps, a warm cloth and soft hands for breech births. No shouting, no rushing, only rhythm, timing, breath. Doctors often looked down on her. They called her old wife, sometimes even witch. But in the middle of the night, when a labor dragged on too long, when a child wouldn't breathe, when the screaming turned to silence, the doctor stepped aside, and the midwife took over. She didn't just know the body. She knew how to wait, how to listen to pain, how to hear things others missed. When it was over, Whether it ended in life or death, she cleaned the linens, swaddled the newborn, or wrapped the body gently, and if the doctor lingered, she might offer him a cup of broth. Say nothing, just sit beside him for a while. She had seen too much to be shaken, and though her name rarely made it into the books, she was the one who knew when to act, and when to simply hold a hand and wait. A prescription of worms. The prescription was simple: boil 3 earthworms, strain them through linen, mix the liquid with vinegar, and drink, while still warm. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't punishment. It was medicine. In the Middle Ages, the line between healing and revulsion was thin. To be cured was often to be disgusted, because when pain ruled the body, and no answers came from books, the cure had to come from somewhere, even the soil beneath your feet. Earthworms were thought to draw out illness. Their wriggling form, so close to the ground, felt connected to something elemental. Doctors believed they cooled fevers, softened tumors, helped the blood move more freely, and so they were gathered, cleaned, boiled, crushed. Worms weren't the only odd prescription. Sometimes it was powdered toad or roasted hedgehog skin, sometimes burnt hair, boiled ants, ground oyster shells, even dried excrement, carefully collected, aged in cloth, and used to treat inflammation. It wasn't madness. It was experimentation without guidance. They tried everything. Because when someone you cared about was dying, you'd try anything. The doctor would write the recipe on a wax tablet: 2 worms before dawn, warm ale with thyme at midday, a blessing over the chest each night. The patient might gag, or laugh, or cry, but they'd drink it, and if they recovered, the doctor would repeat the cure elsewhere, and so the recipe spread. Not through science, but through stories whispered in cottages, passed between midwives, written in the margins of prayer books. We don't know if it worked. Not really. But what matters is this: the doctor didn't give up, even when the cures came from mud, even when the smell turned the stomach, even when his hands shook as he passed over the cup. He still believed that somewhere in the dirt, there might be something that could save you. The astrologer's diagnosis. The doctor unrolled a yellowed scroll across the table. Not a map of the body, but a chart of the stars. He squinted at the tiny inked symbols: a lion crouching beside the moon, Saturn rising in the east, Mercury crossing a pale ring. He murmured to himself, then turned to the sick man lying in bed, and said softly, "Mars is in the wrong house." In the Middle Ages, medicine and astrology were never far apart. To understand illness, one first had to understand the sky. The stars ruled the blood, the planets shaped the bones, each organ answered to a sign: the heart to Leo, the liver to Sagittarius, the lungs to Gemini. A good doctor didn't just ask how you felt, he asked what time you were born, and what day you fell ill. He would consult an ephemeris, a book of planetary movements, and calculate whether it was safe to bleed you today, or if the moon's position might cause excessive loss. If Venus and Jupiter were aligned, he might suggest love magic instead of medicine. If Saturn loomed dark, he'd warn of melancholy. If the moon was waxing, he might delay surgery, because healing was thought to follow the moon's pull, like the tides. Astrology wasn't superstition to them. It was order. The stars gave meaning to chaos. The sky was a clock, and the body, a reflection of the heavens. There were physicians who refused to treat a patient until the chart was drawn, and noble families would send messengers for astrological readings before sending for the surgeon. Even midwives tracked the moon. They believed certain phases made labor easier or harder, and so the doctor's satchel held not just herbs and knives, but charts. Star maps, small tools for drawing circles in ash and ink. He didn't claim to know everything. He only hoped that by understanding the patterns above, he could make sense of the suffering below, because when the stars fell silent, the body often did too. How to remove a demon sting correctly. The woman hadn't spoken in 3 days. Her eyes twitched, unfocused. She thrashed at night, and sometimes whispered names no one in the village recognized. The family tried prayers, then herbs, then the doctor, but when nothing worked, the villagers stopped calling it an illness. They called it possession. The medieval world was full of shadows, not just the ones cast by candlelight, but the ones that lurked behind illness, misfortune, madness. If someone twisted with fever, if they screamed without reason, if they convulsed, babbled, or cursed at nothing, they might not be sick, they might be taken. And so sometimes, medicine gave way to something older, ritual, folk magic, and fear. The doctor was not a priest, but that didn't stop him. He might burn rosemary on a plate, let the smoke fill the corners of the room. He might tie a ribbon of red thread around the wrist to keep the spirit from climbing higher. He might whisper Latin phrases half remembered from old texts, and in the quietest moments, he might press a crucifix to the chest and wait to see if the patient recoiled. If they did, he stepped back. If they didn't, he kept going. There were other treatments too. A clove of garlic beneath the tongue, the ash of a blessed candle mixed into water, or leeches behind the ears to drain the demon out drop by drop. Sometimes the afflicted got better, sometimes they didn't, and sometimes they were hidden away, locked in back rooms, or monasteries, or silence. Because the doctor didn't always know the difference between sickness and something else, and in truth, neither did anyone else. He left the house quietly, the woman behind him, still breathing, still bound. He didn't speak of it again. Some things weren't written in books, some cures weren't cures, only guesses, and prayers. Candles, herbs, and fear. The doctor moved through the cottage carefully, his footsteps soft on the packed earth floor. It was dusk, the light outside fading, the air growing cool. Inside, the only light came from a single candle, thick, dripping, beeswax. Its flame wobbled as he passed, casting long, slow shadows across the walls. This was how many of his visits began, in dim rooms filled with old herbs, stale air, and fear. Candles weren't just for light, they were protection. A flame could guide spirits away, burn sickness out of the air, or even tell the doctor whether a soul was still inside the body. If the flame bent suddenly, some said it meant death was near. If it flickered when no wind blew, the sickness was said to be spiritual. So the doctor would light one first, then open his satchel. The herbs were wrapped in bundles of linen, tied with twine, marked with wax symbols. Some were crushed into powder, others were whole: lavender, sage, fennel, yarrow. He would scatter a pinch over hot coals. Let the smoke rise, let the room fill slowly with a thick, earthy scent. It wasn't just for healing, it was for calming, for pushing back the panic that clung to the edges of the sickbed, because fear was everywhere. Fear of the illness, fear of death, fear of sin, fear that this might not be a sickness at all, but a punishment. So the doctor worked slowly, he whispered. He nodded when people asked questions he couldn't answer. He'd grind dried rose hips into honey to coat a burning throat, or steep marjoram in warm wine to bring sleep. He didn't always believe in the cures, but he believed in the moment of comfort they gave, and sometimes that was enough. When he left, he'd snuff the candle between two fingers, gather the empty jar, and remind the family to burn rosemary daily, just in case, because even if the sickness passed, the fear stayed behind, and in the world he walked through, sometimes fear was the heaviest thing of all. The University of Wrong Ideas. The hall smelled of parchment, wax, and old wool. Long wooden benches lined the stone floor, and at the far end stood a single lectern, carved with the symbols of medicine: a serpent, a staff, a sun. The students sat in silence, cloaks pulled close, quills ready, and from the lectern the master physician read aloud, from a book already 200 years old. This was a university, a place of learning, and yet the knowledge echoed with mistakes. The textbooks were copied by hand, generation after generation, each filled with diagrams of organs shaped like flowers. The liver had 3 chambers. The brain was a cooling system for the heart. The womb wandered the body when left unattended. It was not questioned, it was recited. Students memorized the works of Galen, who had never dissected a human. They learned about humors and temperaments, about which constellation governed which organ, and which scent could drive out melancholy. There were no experiments, no patients, just theory, just words. A student might pass his exam without ever seeing a fever or hearing a cough in the dark. To become a doctor, one had to speak Latin, wear long robes, know how to quote Aristotle, but they were forbidden, by law, by church, by fear, from touching the dead. Anatomy was studied through animals, not humans, and when a body was finally opened, it was with horror, not curiosity. Still, the title of physician carried weight. It meant status, it meant certainty, even if the ideas beneath it were made of sand. Meanwhile, in the villages far below those grand stone towers, people still died of toothaches, still rubbed garlic on burns, still called the midwife before the scholar. because in the end it was rarely the man in robes who knocked on your door, it was the one with the worn boots, the candle, the herbs, the one who had no diploma, but knew how to listen. When the rich died anyway, the manor was quiet. Outside, servants whispered near the stables. Inside, the candles burned low, their wax pooling into silver plates. Upstairs, in the great bed beneath a canopy of embroidered cloth, the lord of the house was dying, and nothing was working. He had the best of everything. Feather-stuffed pillows, furs from the East, a physician trained in Paris, with rings on every finger. Jars of imported herbs lined the shelf. Cinnamon, saffron, ginger, ground pearls. But still, he gasped, his hands trembled, and his eyes, once sharp with command, now stared at nothing. The humours had been balanced. The stars had been charted. He had been bled, and bled again. A gold coin placed beneath his tongue, a silver cross held above his chest. But still, he slipped further away. It wasn't supposed to be like this. The poor were meant to die in the fields, in the dark, alone. The rich were supposed to survive. They had doctors, and relics, and prayers commissioned by monks far away. But illness didn't care for titles. It passed through stone walls as easily as straw huts, and the more the doctor tried, the more helpless he became. He burned incense. He summoned a barber to drain more blood. He wrote a final prescription, ink trembling on the page. Wine warmed with clove, 3 times before midnight. But it didn't matter. By morning, the house was draped in black. The doctor removed his gloves slowly, and stepped out past servants who would not meet his eyes. Later, he'd hear the whispers that maybe he hadn't tried hard enough, that maybe he'd used the wrong herb, that maybe, deep down, he had never known what he was doing at all. But he said nothing, because he knew the truth. Even the best fail, even the richest fall, and when death comes to the manor, it looks the same as it does in a cottage, quiet, cold, and final. Why monks had the real knowledge. Far from the noisy cities and the bleeding bowls, beyond the reach of royal physicians and hurried barber surgeons, there stood a stone building tucked between hills and silence, the monastery. Inside its thick walls, where candles never fully chased away the shadows, a monk sat with his head bent low, a quill scratching softly on stretched parchment. He was not a doctor, he took no patients, but he knew more than most of them did. Monks were keepers of the old knowledge. They copied texts that no one else could read, Greek, Latin, Arabic. They preserved the words of Hippocrates, Galen, Avicenna, and whispered fragments passed down from times even older. They studied herbs, measured the stars, listened to the seasons, and they wrote everything down, not for fame, not for gold, but because silence had room for learning, and time moved differently behind monastery walls. In the infirmary wing, behind low wooden doors, they tended to their brothers with calm, steady hands, no panic, no guesswork. They used ointments made from marigold and honey. They steeped thyme for coughs, sliced onions laid across the chest to draw out fever, and if they didn't understand the soul of a sickness, they still knew the body. They believed healing was part of prayer, that tending to the sick was a sacred duty, and that knowledge, like faith, must be copied patiently, line by line, without error. Some monasteries had gardens filled with nothing but medicinal plants, every root, every leaf, labeled in neat, faded ink, and their libraries filled with secrets most physicians had never seen. Books so rare that kings sent messengers to request copies, books chained to the shelves too precious to loan. The monks didn't bleed their patients, they didn't reach for sores or charts of the stars. They reached for elderflower, for warm broth, for quiet, and when a life slipped away they rang a bell, and wrote the name in a small steady script, because they knew life wasn't something to fight against, it was something to understand and honor. A night call to the peasant hut. The knock came after dark. 3 soft taps on the doctor's wooden door. Outside, the wind carried the scent of rain and mud, and the voice that followed was quiet, hurried, and full of worry. "She's burning. We need you." No horse, no lantern, just a boy with bare feet and a cloak too thin for the weather. He didn't wait for a reply, just turned and started walking. The doctor followed. The road was narrow, lined with stones and puddles, and the only light came from the doctor's lantern swinging with each step. By the time they reached the hut, the wind had stilled, but the air inside the walls felt heavier than outside. A single room, low beams, a dirt floor swept clean. The fire in the hearth was nearly out, and beside it, on a thin straw mat, A girl lay curled, slick with sweat, her breath short and shallow. Her mother hovered beside her, wringing a cloth with shaking hands. A brother crouched in the corner, eyes wide. No one spoke. The doctor knelt beside her, felt her forehead, listened to the faint rattle in her chest. He opened his bag without a word, took out dried thyme, boiled it in a pot of water, poured the steam into a bowl, and leaned her face over it, covering both with a thin cloth. She stirred, coughed, then went still again. He crushed garlic, mixed it with honey, and let a drop fall between her lips, rubbed mustard on her soles, placed a warm stone beneath her back. There was no diagnosis, no name, only signs, and the memory of how other fevers had looked, and ended. The night passed slowly. He stayed. At one point, the girl opened her eyes, just for a moment, and the mother gasped. Not because she'd spoken, she hadn't, but because her gaze had returned, soft, clear, and still part of this world. The doctor stood at dawn, stiff, tired. He left behind a folded scrap of cloth, soaked in sage and vinegar, and told them to keep the air warm, and the fire lit. He didn't ask for payment. There was none. As he stepped out into the grey morning, he thought only of the road home, and the weight of a life, not lost, not yet. A royal nosebleed. The chamber was silent, but not peaceful. Dozens of servants stood along the edges, eyes lowered, hands clasped. The physician was kneeling beside the throne, while the king sat very still, one hand cupped beneath his nose, already stained red. It was just a nosebleed. But when royalty bled, the entire court held its breath. The physician moved slowly, as though speed itself might offend the crown. He dipped a cloth in rosewater, folded it precisely, and offered it without meeting the king's eyes. Blood dripped. Not much, but enough to raise questions. Was it the dry air? Too much heat? An imbalance of the humors? A sign from heaven? The physician had read of such things in books. In royal cases, nothing was simple. A common man's nosebleed was just that. But a king's could be a warning, so he reached for gentler remedies. A pinch of powdered comfrey, to stop the bleeding. Vinegar boiled with nettle, applied just behind the ears. He muttered Latin phrases under his breath. Not prayers, but instructions copied from a manuscript in faded ink. Meanwhile, the courtiers whispered. Was the king cursed? Was it poison? Had someone offended the church? The bleeding stopped, eventually, and the king rose, pale but calm. He waved a hand, not in dismissal, but in quiet gratitude. Or maybe to make sure no one looked too closely. The physician bowed low. He'd done little, really, but the perception of control mattered more than the cure. He was ushered out of the chamber, with a new coin in his hand, and the unspoken understanding that tomorrow it might not be a nosebleed, and that next time he would need to know even more. Bloodletting by moonlight. The room was cold, and the candles were low, but outside the moon was bright, too bright to ignore. The doctor unrolled a small cloth bundle beside the bed. Inside a curved blade, a pewter bowl, and a folded diagram of the human body drawn from memory. The patient, an old man with trembling hands, said nothing. He simply bared his arm, as he had many times before. Tonight was the right time. Not because of symptoms, because of the sky. In the world of medieval medicine, bloodletting was never done blindly. It was not just a matter of pain or pressure. It was timing. The moon ruled the tides, and the tides, they believed, ruled the blood. If you bled a man under the wrong phase, you could draw out his life instead of his illness. If you did it when the moon was full, the body was too full, and bleeding could be dangerous. If you waited for the waning moon, the humors might retreat just enough to be safely released. Tonight, the moon was in its third quarter, the perfect night for a careful cut. The doctor tied a narrow strip of linen above the elbow. The old man turned his head away, but did not flinch. The blade, clean, curved, cool to the touch, sliced just enough to open the skin. Dark blood flowed, slow, steady, into the shallow bowl below. The doctor watched the color. If it was too bright, it meant heat. If it was thick, it meant melancholy. He murmured the usual words. Not quite prayers, not quite science. When he had taken enough, he pressed a pad of wool dipped in vinegar to the wound, and wrapped it in linen, tight, but not cruel. He handed the old man a cup of warmed wine, mixed with thyme and marjoram. They said this helped the body recover, but also, perhaps, soothed the soul. Outside, the moon cast long shadows across the dirt path. The bowl was emptied into the earth. Because no one wanted to see the blood again, it had served its purpose. It had been released so that balance, however fragile, could return. How to smell death before the fever broke, before the breath stopped, before the family gathered in silence. The doctor could already sense it, not by sight, not by sound, but by scent. It was faint at first, barely there, a sweetness where there should be none, a weight to the air that clung to the back of the throat. This was the smell of death. They didn't have words for it, no medical term, no Latin phrase, only quiet remarks passed between doctors and midwives in low voices. The air is turning. The body's begun to loosen. It's not long now. It wasn't just rot, not yet. It was something else, a shift in the body itself. The scent of endings. To the medieval doctor, smell was a tool. Illness had a fragrance. So did infection. So did recovery. He learned it, without being taught. Just from years of leaning close to fevered skin, lifting soiled linens, washing his hands in vinegar that never seemed strong enough. The scent of death wasn't sudden. It was slow, soft, like the final ember of a fire that had burned too long. Sometimes it came hours before the final breath, sometimes days. The body began to cool at the edges, even while the forehead still burned. The skin changed. Not in color, in tone. Less elastic, less present. And then the scent would come. Metallic, sweet, wrong. It drifted through the air like a memory. There was nothing to be done by then. No herb could stop it. No charm could reverse it. Only comfort remained. And quiet. The doctor would stay, hold the hand, adjust the blanket, whisper a verse he didn't quite believe. Because when you could smell death, you understood it was no longer a battle, just a passage, and all you could do was make the leaving gentle. A doctor's rotten toolkit. The bag was heavy, leather, darkened by years of rain and handling, stitched and restitched where the seams had failed. It smelled faintly of vinegar and something else, age, damp cloth, iron. This was the doctor's toolkit, and inside it was almost nothing anyone today would trust. The first tool was the lancet, small, sharp, rust-specked, used again and again to open veins, drain humors, slice blisters. He wiped it clean with wine or spit, then tucked it back in a flap of cloth, ready for the next wound. There were leeches in a jar, still wriggling, half submerged in muddy water. They didn't need feeding. They only needed a body, a thin metal spoon for eye infections, a curved hook for drawing out infected teeth, or trying to, a saw, not large, but purposeful, meant for bone, wrapped in twine for grip, though it still slipped when blood made the handle slick, and of course, the bleeding bowl, pewter, dented, marked with a faint line where the fluid should rise no higher. He carried waxed linen, smelling faintly of mold, bits of cotton, scraps of wool, strings for binding, a dried sponge to wipe sweat from the dying, a single cracked mirror to check breath at the lips. There were herbs too, but most of them had faded to dust. Yarrow, sage, dried rose petals, and something once green now turned grey, a feather quill, a slate for notes, a charm on a leather cord, tucked in the deepest part of the bag, never spoken of, but never forgotten. Nothing was sterilized, nothing was certain, but this bag was all he had, all anyone had. And when he walked the long road to a cottage in the hills, or climbed stairs to a noble's chamber, this was what he carried. A few blades, a few bottles, a few guesses, and the quiet hope that something inside might be enough to help. Diagnosing by urine color. The doctor held the flask up to the light. It was small, round-bellied, and made of thick glass. Inside a pale yellow liquid, still warm from the body that made it. He didn't speak. He just turned it slowly in his hands, watching how the light passed through it, how it settled, how it swirled. This was diagnosis. In the Middle Ages, urine was everything. It was the window into the body, the mirror of the soul. Doctors carried color charts, hand-painted and copied from ancient books, 20, 30, even 40 shades of yellow, brown, red, green. Each one meant something different. Pale yellow, excess phlegm. Deep gold, heat of the liver. Reddish, blood rising. Cloudy, humors in turmoil. Blue or black, they rarely lived long enough to explain. It was called uroscopy, and it was taken very seriously. The patient might never be touched. The pulse might go unmeasured. but the urine, that was carefully poured into a flask, stopped with wax or cloth, and studied in silence. Some doctors sniffed it, some tasted it. A practice older than memory. Because the sweetness of urine could signal a wasting disease, what we now call diabetes. But they didn't know the word, only that some people melted slowly from the inside, and their water turned sweet before the end. The color, the clarity, the scent, even the way bubbles rose and broke, all were clues. A doctor might scribble down notes on a wax tablet, urine thick, golden, odor sharp, fever likely, or simply whisper to the family, "We will bleed tomorrow before sunrise." Some towns even had urine messengers, boys who carried flasks from one house to the next, from bed to apothecary, from cottage to scholar. The body itself didn't need to travel, just the evidence. And so through glass and guesswork, the doctor made his decisions, not with certainty, not with science, but with a practiced eye and a quiet trust in the oldest liquid truth he knew. Why surgery was a last resort? The knife lay flat on the table, not shining, not clean, just waiting. The room smelled of sweat and old wood. The patient was already pale, jaw clenched, hands shaking on his lap. He hadn't been told everything, not out loud, but he understood. Surgery was not hope, it was desperation. In the medieval world, cutting the body was unnatural. It went against balance, against the order of the humors, against the divine structure of flesh. The body was a closed vessel. What was inside was meant to stay inside. Doctors studied books, priests studied souls, but surgery, that was left to barbers, to butchers, to men with strong hands and short prayers. Pain relief was minimal, sometimes a bit of wine, sometimes nothing at all. You were held down by friends or family, and once it began, it had to be quick. There was no stitching deep wounds, no transfusions, no antiseptic, just speed and faith. A cautery iron would be heated in the fire, glowing red, ready to press into the open flesh when it was done, not to seal it cleanly, but to burn it closed. Surgery was a last resort, when the limb was black, when the swelling wouldn't stop, when the tooth abscessed into the jawbone, when a blade had already torn the body open, and something had to be pushed back in. Only then, only when there was no other path, because too many didn't survive the knife, not from the cut, but from what came after, fever, rot, silence. But still, they did it, in barns, in stone rooms, on kitchen tables, not because they believed in it fully, but because sometimes it worked, and when it did, when the fever broke, and the wound healed, and the patient rose again, that one life whispered louder than 100 losses. The plague doctor's mask. The figure moved slowly through the street. Boots on stone, cloak brushing against doorways. Children peered from behind shutters, not curious, not playful, just afraid because they recognized the mask. Long, pale, like a bird's beak carved from bone. 2 glass circles where eyes should be. No mouth, no expression, just silence, and the smell of herbs. The plague doctor didn't speak often. He didn't need to. His presence said everything. Someone inside was dying, or already dead, and the mask, strange, almost theatrical to us now, was a shield. Inside the beak, packed carefully, lavender, mint, cloves, rosemary, dried rose petals, and sometimes vinegar-soaked sponges or camphor, because the air itself was thought to be poisonous. The miasma, the bad air, was said to carry death, so the doctor breathed through flowers. He carried a cane, not for walking, for distance. He used it to point, to lift sheets, to prod the living and the dead alike. He did not touch. His gloves were waxed. His coat was coated in oil or suet to repel moisture. A wide-brimmed hat marked him as a physician, but no one needed the hat. Everyone knew the mask. Sometimes, he wrote down symptoms. More often, he recorded names. The ledger mattered more than the cure, because there was no cure. He might bring herbs. He might lance a boil. He might recommend leeches, though even he didn't believe they'd help. Mostly, he stayed long enough to confirm that it was plague, then moved on to the next door. Inside the mask, it was dark, hot, lonely. He heard his own breath, slow, filtered through damp petals. He saw the world through glass, and yet he came back every day. Because someone had to. The mask wasn't just armor, it was witness, and behind it stood a man who had chosen to stand between the dying and everything that came after. Screaming patients, silent walls. At first there was only murmuring, shuffling footsteps, the clink of a pail being set down, the low creak of a door closing behind someone who would not leave for weeks or years. But by midnight, the screams began. High, broken, sudden, then silence again. The stone walls did not echo. They simply absorbed the sound. This was not a hospital. Not truly. It was a house of the mad, a place for those whose minds had frayed beyond what anyone could explain. And though the doctors came here, they did not always bring medicine. They brought restraints, prayers, worn theories about humors that boiled over, or black bile that drowned the mind. Some patients howled, some laughed at nothing, some rocked back and forth for hours, days, others just stared, at walls, at hands, at things no one else could see. And the building said nothing. It stood still, cold, cleaned weekly, maybe, a stone cage with beds lined in straw, bolted doors, and windows too small to climb through. The doctor would make his rounds. He might ask the patient's name, though many no longer remembered it. He would nod solemnly, note something on a slate, then move on. There were treatments in a way, cold baths, bleeding of course, herbs to dull the mind, henbane, belladonna, wormwood, and sometimes a kind voice and a warm drink, though those were rarer. But the walls remembered it all, the scratched floors, the prayers, the sobs, the quiet moaning in the hours just before dawn. And when the sun rose again, the building looked the same, still, empty of answers, full of lives left quietly apart. Because in the end, no one knew where the mind went when it wandered, only that once it left, it rarely came back. Maggots, mud, and misery. The wound was open. Not clean, not healing. It wept slowly in the heat. A mix of blood, pus, and the dampness of too many days spent lying still. And in the folds of rotting cloth that covered it, there were maggots, small, white, squirming, alive, and somehow helping. The medieval doctor didn't flinch, because he had seen what came from wounds left to rot, and strangely, those with maggots often did better. The flesh beneath them looked pink, healthier, as if the insects knew what needed removing. They were not summoned, but once they arrived, they were tolerated, sometimes even welcomed. Mud, too, was used, though not always with understanding, applied to fevered foreheads, packed around twisted limbs, smeared onto skin in thick, cold handfuls. Certain kinds of clay were prized for their cooling nature. They drew out the heat, dried up the poison, or so the healer hoped. Some muds were mixed with crushed herbs, others with ash. Some were just mud, and prayer, and through it all, misery. The patient groaned quietly in the dark, shifting beneath damp wool. The doctor pressed his hand to the skin, checked for warmth, and listened for changes in the breath. Sometimes he whispered comfort. Sometimes he simply waited. Because once the wound was too deep, there was little left to offer but stillness and time. But sometimes, the strangest things worked. The mud cooled the skin. The maggots cleared the dead flesh. The patient's breathing slowed, not from death, but from relief. And in the morning, the wound smelled a little less foul, looked a little less angry, which, in this world, was a kind of miracle. Learning from pig guts. The courtyard was quiet, just after dawn. A wooden table had been dragged into the light. A basin of water sat nearby, already tinted pink. On the table lay the body of a pig, still, cooling in the morning air. Its belly had been opened, carefully, and around the table stood a group of men, young, robed, uncertain, holding their breath. This was a lesson, not in farming, not in cooking, but in anatomy. The church forbade the cutting of human bodies in many places. The soul, it was said, remained too long in the flesh, and so, to learn about people, the doctors practiced on pigs, because their insides were similar, not identical, but close enough. A pig's heart pumped, its lungs filled and emptied, its intestines coiled in long steaming ropes, and its liver, massive, shining, soft, told them more than a dozen old books ever could. The master physician pointed with a long stick, not touching. He named each part aloud in Latin, the students repeating after him in quiet voices. Hepa, pulmo, cors ventriculus. Then came the questions. What happened when too much bile pooled in the gut? What if the liver turned black? Where did the blood go after it passed through the heart? Some of the students knew, some only guessed. None had seen the inside of a human body, but this pig was their closest truth. The smell was strong, not rotten, but thick with heat and life. The doctor wore no gloves. He had seen worse. He cut slowly, folding the organs open, with the care of someone turning a sacred page. He had done this many times, and still, each body was different. Sometimes he found things that didn't belong, stones inside the bladder, strange fluids, twisted veins. He made notes in a leather book no one else would ever read. When it was over, the body was covered with straw, carried away, the table washed, the students dismissed. But they left with more than memory. They had seen how the body folded and fit together, how it sagged, moved, held heat, and even though they couldn't name every part, they began to understand something deeper, that the body was not a puzzle to solve, but a world to slowly enter, through patience and blood and silence. The town with no healer. The village looked ordinary from the hill, thatched roofs, smoke rising soft and slow from chimneys, a few sheep in a pen, a broken fence someone meant to mend weeks ago. But when the doctor arrived, his boots dusted with the long road behind him, he noticed something else, a quiet that didn't feel like peace. There was no one waiting. No one came with a child in their arms, no elder leaning on a cane, no cough behind the shutters. It wasn't that no one was sick, it was that there was no one left to help. The last healer had died in the spring. She'd been old, kind, not trained, not titled, but she knew when to place a poultice, when to draw a fever down with vinegar, how to stitch a wound without trembling. Now her hut stood empty. The herbs in her garden wilted without hands to tend them. The tools rusted in a wooden box beneath her bed. They had buried her with no successor. The villagers did what they could. They boiled nettle tea. They soaked wounds in wine when they could spare it. They prayed, but illness had returned. A fever that crept from house to house, taking a child here, an old man there, then resting a while, before starting again. And when the doctor came at last, summoned by a message carried miles by foot, he found a village full of frightened eyes and quiet suffering. He stayed 3 days. That was all he could give. He moved from house to house, sharing what little he had, mustard seeds for aching joints, elderflower for coughs, yarrow to slow the bleeding. He mixed, measured, and murmured instructions, wrote recipes in charcoal on bits of broken slate, and before he left he took a girl aside, no older than 12, and placed his worn satchel in her arms. Not the good tools, just the basics. A sprig of rosemary, a wax tablet, a small knife dulled with use. Watch, listen, he told her. Write it all down. Because the town couldn't afford to be without a healer again, not even for a season, not even for a day. Herbal cures that worked, kind of. Not everything in the old doctor's pouch was superstition. Some things actually helped a little. Not with the drama of a cure, no miracles, no instant peace, but with small steady comforts that turned pain down just enough to breathe. The best healers knew which plants whispered quietly toward healing. Not loudly, but enough. Willow bark for pain, scraped, dried, steeped in boiling water. A bitter drink, but one that softened the ache of joints after a long day, or dulled a throbbing tooth, just enough to sleep. They didn't know it held salicin, the early ancestor of aspirin, but they knew it helped. Kind of. Yarrow for bleeding, crushed and pressed against wounds. Its leaves, finely feathered, grew wild in fields. It stung at first, then cooled. Sometimes the bleeding slowed. Sometimes it didn't. But they used it anyway, because it had worked once, and that was enough to try again. Garlic for infection, not always by mouth. Sometimes crushed into salves, stuffed gently into the ear, rubbed on the feet. It was sharp, smelly, alive with some unseen heat. And when an abscess began to shrink, or a fever lessened after its use, well, no one questioned the why. Only that it did. Something. Kind of. Lavender to calm the heart, boiled in wine, hung in bundles near pillows, carried in pouches around the neck. Not a cure, not for the body, but for rest, for fear, for the nights when the walls felt too close and the dreams too loud. Some plants made people worse, some killed quietly, but the ones that helped, they were remembered, passed from hand to hand, hut to hut, copied in crooked script into the margins of prayer books, because even a little relief, a little breath between pain and sleep, was something sacred, something worth preserving. Graveyard anatomy lessons. The gate creaked only once. The rest of the night was still, The moon hung low, barely clearing the treetops, and a fog had settled just above the graves, as if the earth itself was breathing softly in its sleep. Two figures moved between the stones, careful, wordless, familiar with the path. They carried nothing more than a lantern, a bundle of cloth, and a silence that meant they'd done this before. This was a lesson. Anatomy was forbidden in many places. Studying the dead meant disturbing the soul, and so the curious learned in shadows. Graveyards became classrooms, not with chalk or scrolls, but with the cold weight of flesh. The body had been buried only days before, still fresh enough for learning, not yet returned fully to the earth. They worked quickly. One held the lantern, eyes always watching the trees. The other knelt, unfolding tools from a damp cloth, a small knife, a pair of tongs, a stick of wax to seal what could not be closed again. There was no time to be afraid, only time to see. The ribs, how they arched, like a cage. The heart, still nestled in its cradle behind bone. The liver, dark and silent. The hands, still curled, no longer trembling. They whispered names of parts in Latin, as if naming them might somehow undo the wrongness of it all. These were not criminals, not thieves, not men without conscience. They were students, physicians, monks, sometimes, men who wanted to understand what no living patient could show them, because books could lie, but the body didn't. And here, in the hush of the graveyard, they could finally trace the mysteries with their own eyes. When it was over, they wrapped the body again, careful, reverent, not out of guilt, but out of respect. The dead had taught them something, and in that quiet lesson beneath the moon, they had seen the shape of life itself, layered, warm once, now fading into stillness. They left the grave as they found it, more or less, and walked away without looking back, because some knowledge was taken in silence, and kept that way forever. The child with fever dreams. The fever had been burning for 2 days. The child lay curled in a small bed stuffed with straw and herbs, the blanket rising and falling in short, unsteady rhythms. Her cheeks were flushed deep red, her eyelids fluttering, and her hands twitched gently in her sleep. She whispered things no one understood. Names, colors, words from dreams too large for her tiny body. The doctor sat beside her, silent, watching. He had seen fever before, in soldiers, in mothers, in the old. But when it came for a child, it felt different, not more dangerous, just more unfair. There was no shouting, no cries of pain, just the slow, rolling heat and the quiet tumble of a mind slipping away. Her mother had done all she could. She'd boiled water with thyme, hung lavender above the door, prayed, and when none of it worked, she walked barefoot through the night to fetch the doctor from 3 fields away. Now all they could do was wait. The doctor soaked cloth in vinegar and elderflower, placed it gently on the girl's forehead. He held her hand, not to check the pulse, but simply to be there, to anchor her, to remind her that someone still sat in the room. She mumbled again, this time a song, one he didn't know. He wondered if it was something her mother sang long ago, or if the fever had written it brand new in her dreams. He placed a bowl of sliced onion beneath the bed. Some said it drew out illness, some just liked the smell. It didn't matter, because in moments like this, no cure was too small to try. He stayed through the night. The fire burned low. The child drifted deeper, then suddenly stirred. She opened her eyes, not fully, just enough. The fever hadn't left, but it had softened, and for a moment, the room felt less like a battlefield and more like a cradle. Why most doctors fled the sick. They heard the first coughs in the night. Not loud, not alarming, just one breath out of place, wet, rattling, buried under wool, and whispers. By morning, 3 more were coughing. By evening, someone was gone. Not dead, just gone. Packed up and left without a word. And the next morning, the doctor left too, not with a speech, not with goodbyes. He simply closed the shutters on his quarters, took only what he could carry, and disappeared down the road before the bells rang for dawn. You might think it was fear, and you'd be right. But not only fear of death. Doctors fled because they'd seen what came next, because they knew how it ended. Not with healing, not with quiet recovery, but with blackened limbs, breath like ash, eyes that dried out while the body still lived. They'd seen the plague before. They knew the patterns, and they knew that no book, no leech, no concoction of vinegar and sage could stop what was already coming. So they ran. Some went to the countryside, some to larger towns where the sickness hadn't reached yet. Some vanished altogether. They didn't leave out of cruelty. At least, not always. They left because they were human, and humans break when they witness too much death in too little time. A few stayed. A few locked their doors and took no visitors. They burned herbs at the window. They tried to treat from a distance, leaving medicine in baskets by the step, refusing payment, refusing thanks. But most just disappeared. And the people remembered. When a family was sick, they didn't send for the doctor first. They sent for the midwife, or the bone setter, or the quiet woman with a pouch of dried lavender and a prayer older than any Latin phrase, because she stayed. And when death came, she knew how to close the eyes, fold the arms, and sit with the silence. The doctor's silence, by contrast, came from absence. In cities there were rumors that the wealthiest physicians wore perfumed masks and stayed far from the sickbeds, that some were paid to diagnose without touching, that they drew symbols above doorways, not to heal, but to warn others to stay away. And sometimes they were right, because medicine, in those days, was not a promise, it was a guess, a ritual, a fragile line drawn in chalk between the living and the dead, and when the line blurred, most doctors stepped back, but people remembered. They remembered who left and who stayed. They passed down those names not in books but in stories told beside fire, in herbs grown at the back of the garden, in quiet glances passed between mothers and daughters when the cough returned. Not all doctors were cowards, but not all were brave, and in the end, those who stayed often weren't doctors at all, just people who couldn't bring themselves to look away. When mercury was the medicine, the bottle was small, glass, darkened by time and smoke, stoppered with wax and sealed with a faded scrap of twine, and inside, liquid metal. It moved strangely, not like water, not like oil. It rolled and gathered in little silvery beads, cool even in the hand, and mesmerizing to watch. It shimmered like a mirror that never settled. They called it quicksilver, and once for a long, strange stretch of history, doctors believed it could save your life. Not everyone could afford it. It came from mines, from deep inside the earth, where the air was poisonous and the stones sweated heat. Miners died young, their teeth fell out, their hands shook, their minds unraveled like thread in boiling water. But the mercury kept flowing, because the world above believed it could cure. It started, they say, with sores, open wounds that would not heal, rot that crept across the mouth, the skin, the bones. Some said it was punishment for sin. Some said it came from bad women, bad thoughts, bad air, but the disease was real, and so were the bodies left behind. A physician once wrote that mercury cleanses the body with fire. It was believed to drive out the poison, to burn the sickness from within, and so they gave it to patients in salves and pastes, in pills and steaming bowls. Sometimes they rubbed it into the skin, thinking it would seep through and pull the rot with it. Sometimes they boiled it, placed a towel over the patient's head, and let them inhale the vapor until their breath trembled and their thoughts clouded. Sometimes they simply made them drink it. At first it seemed to work. The sores dried, the fever cooled, the rash faded. The patient would rise from bed, wobble to the door, and thank the doctor with trembling hands. But the cure didn't last. The mercury stayed in the body. It moved where it wanted, to the liver, the brain, the gums. Soon the teeth loosened. The eyes grew hollow, the voice slurred. Some began to speak in circles, or wander the village muttering riddles no one could understand. But by then the doctor had gone, off to the next patient, the next cure. In wealthier cities, mercury treatments became fashionable. They called it sweating the poison out. A nobleman with sores would be wrapped in furs, sat beside a brazier, and fed pills until he dripped sweat into the floorboards. He would sleep like that for hours, sometimes days, and when he woke, if he woke, he would say he felt cleaner, hollowed out, cured. But his body told a different story. It wasn't just for one disease either. Mercury was given for coughs, for fevers, for melancholy. Mothers were warned not to take it while pregnant, though by then it was often too late. Some healers used it on infants, in doses as small as a raindrop, believing it would bring balance to their little humors. The line between help and harm was razor thin, and often it vanished altogether. But still they used it, because when you are desperate, when nothing else works, a shimmering metal that dances in your palm feels like hope. Doctors defended it. They wrote long treatises, they recorded dosages, arguments, successes, but the truth whispered beneath the parchment. The death toll, the shaking hands, the lost names. Centuries later we understand, we call it toxic, we seal it in warnings, and teach students to fear it. But in those earlier days, those cold houses and plague years, when death sat beside every hearth, mercury was a gamble people took because it was all they had left. Not because they were foolish, but because they believed the cure must hurt if it was to heal, and nothing hurt quite like quicksilver. The barber who did brain surgery. He was not a doctor. Not by training, not by title, not by the letters written after a name in elegant Latin script. He was a barber, a man of razors and basins, of towels steamed over fires and chatter exchanged in the smell of soap and sweat. But when the injury came, when the boy fell from the ladder and his skull cracked against the barn floor, they didn't call the priest first. They didn't call the doctor. They ran for the barber, because in those days, he was the one with the knife. People forget the barber and the surgeon were once the same man. They shared the same shop, the same chair, the same set of instruments hanging beside the window in a worn leather roll, stained by time and use. He cut hair. Yes. He trimmed beards and lanced boils. He pulled teeth while customers bit leather straps. He set dislocated shoulders with a sharp twist. And once, he opened a man's skull and let the pressure out. It wasn't glamorous. There were no operating theaters, no gloves, no antiseptic. The patient would sit, or lie flat, or be held down by two stout men while the barber did what had to be done. There was pain, always, and blood. Buckets of it, in some cases. But there was also skill, rough, practiced skill. The barber learned by doing, by watching his father, by watching death, and by knowing exactly how deep he could cut before it became permanent. On market days, he was cheerful. He carried a towel over one shoulder. He twirled scissors between his fingers and sharpened blades with long, slow strokes that made the children stare. But in the evenings he boiled cloths and wiped down his tools with a care that was almost reverent. He had seen the inside of people, not just their skin, but their pain. When he opened a skull, it was with a trepan, a tool that looked like a tiny drill, meant to bore a hole through the bone without piercing the soft mass beneath. He learned to stop when the skull thinned. He learned to listen for the sound of pressure releasing. A soft hiss, a warm scent of blood, and something older. Sometimes it saved a life. The fever broke. The shaking stopped. The patient slept without screaming. Other times, it didn't. But still, they came to him. Because there were no neurosurgeons, no scans, no sterile rooms with lights overhead. Just him. A man with a steady hand, a clean cloth, and a willingness to cut when no one else would. He wasn't respected by scholars, not truly. They scoffed at him from behind vellum pages and whispered that he was unlearned, dangerous, primitive. But he didn't write books. He wrote survival on the living bodies of those too poor to be seen by doctors and too frightened to wait. His tools hung from hooks, each worn with use, a curved knife, a spoon for lifting bone, a needle for stitching skin torn open by time or error. He sharpened them, not just for show, but because dull blades kill, and he had seen enough death to know the difference. Years later, when he passed, they didn't bury him with honors. There was no monument. Just a shop closed for good, a leather roll of tools left to gather dust, and half a dozen villagers who could still walk straight because of the barber's hands. And in some small towns, they say if you open old parish records, you might find a quiet line. Wound opened. Bone lifted. Child survived. Barber present. Not a doctor, not a scholar, but someone who did what had to be done, and did it alone. A village built on superstition. The village wasn't on any proper map. If it ever had a name, it was whispered only by those who had lived there long enough to forget why it mattered. It sat nestled between two low hills, half hidden by forest, with a crooked stream that curved like a question mark just beyond the grazing fields. It wasn't much to look at. A scattering of thatched roofs, a church that leaned ever so slightly to one side, and a road that became mud the moment the rain began. But it was known quietly, and only among the few, as the place where medicine was a little different. They didn't call for doctors, not the ones with wax seals on their scrolls, or fine leather shoes caked in powdered chalk. Those men came once, years ago, tried to measure the children's pulses, offered jars of sour-scented salves. They left 2 days later, pale and rattled, after the healer spat in the fire and told them their bones would never lie flat again. No one ever saw them return. Here, medicine lived in stories. A charm against fever hung by every door, braided straw, 7 knots, tied on a moonless night. Warts were passed to stones by whispering the name of the offending person, and burying the rock beneath crossroads. Coughs were treated with boiled nettle, and a prayer spoken backward over the steam. Children were taught to never accept bread from anyone wearing bells around their ankles, not because of poison, but because of memory. Because once, long ago, a girl vanished after doing just that. They didn't write any of this down. It was taught in looks, in gestures, in the subtle ways one woman might shift her apron, or the way a man might leave 3 coins face down on the threshold of the healer's cottage. They trusted patterns, not prescriptions. They knew which flowers bloomed near the graves, and which ones to never bring inside. They knew that bees must be told when a member of the family died, lest they fly off in mourning and never return. A midwife in the village once cured a boy of seizures by tying a toad's foot into his sash and singing a song no one recognized. The seizures stopped. No one questioned it. A pale woman who lived at the edge of the wood could predict illness in livestock based on the number of blackbirds that circled the hilltop at sunrise. She rarely spoke, but when she pointed to your cow, you made peace with the idea that it wouldn't last the week. To outsiders, it seemed ridiculous, a world of herbs, dreams and half-remembered pagan rituals wrapped in linen and worn like truth. But the people here remembered things that others had forgotten. They remembered the winter when no child coughed because every home had a bundle of dried yarrow hung above the hearth. They remembered the year the plague passed them by, while other towns held mass graves, and credited the mossy stone beside the chapel that no one dared to touch. They remembered, and remembering was its own kind of medicine. Once a scholar came. He wore a fine coat, and spoke in careful Latin, and said he was writing a book about folk treatments of the superstitious class. The villagers nodded, offered him a room, fed him warm bread and broth. On the 2nd night, he asked too many questions. On the 3rd, he opened a bottle he wasn't meant to touch. On the 4th, he was gone. His things remained. So did his book, half filled with careful notes and sketches of charms. Someone burned it, quietly, without anger. Because in this village, you didn't try to explain what worked, you just trusted it. And when people spoke of the village later, they often laughed, called it backward, silly. But if one of them fell ill in the city, if the fevers rose too high and the doctor's hands trembled as he opened his satchel, they might, just once, remember that crooked village with the nettle steam and the whispering winds, and wonder. The saint who healed with bread. They said she wasn't a saint, at least not officially. No church had canonized her. No miracles had been declared in Rome, but in the village where she once lived, people whispered her name with the same reverence they gave to prayers. She lived in a stone house that sagged toward the earth, its roof thick with moss, its chimney always trailing smoke that smelled faintly of rosemary. And she baked, every day, without fail, even in deep winter. She wasn't young, but no one could say how old she was either. Her hands were worn but steady, her apron always dusted with flour, and her voice when she spoke was soft, like someone remembering a song they hadn't sung in decades. She didn't carry a staff, didn't wear white, didn't call herself holy, but when a child came down with fever, or a farmer's leg turned black at the edges, someone would come to her door and ask very quietly for bread. It wasn't ordinary bread, that's what the old women said, not made with just flour, salt and yeast, but something else, some secret ingredient that no one had ever seen. Some said she ground dried violets into the dough. Others believed she whispered into it while it rose. A few swore she used water from the well that no one else dared drink from. She never said. All anyone knew was that when you ate her bread, something happened. The pain faded. The coughing eased. The mind, long clouded with grief or fever, would clear just enough to look someone in the eye again. The sick always shared it with their family. It was never eaten alone. One slice, warm from the cloth she wrapped it in, was passed from hand to hand around the fire as the wind rattled the shutters. And when the loaf was gone, people slept more deeply, dreamed more gently, or, in some cases, died peacefully. That was healing too, in its own way. Not everyone believed, of course. A physician once visited the village, drawn by the rumors. He demanded to see the bread, the ingredients, the method. She gave him a loaf, wrapped it in plain linen, said nothing. He took it home, tested it, dissected it, found nothing unusual. No mercury, no mold, no herbs strong enough to stir the blood. He called it nonsense, declared her a fraud, but a month later, when his own daughter fell ill, he returned quietly, under cover of night, and knocked at her door again. She said nothing, just handed him another loaf, and closed the door. When she died, they found dozens of loaves, each wrapped and stored in clay jars, each still fresh, as though waiting. The village built a shrine of sorts, not a grand one, just a small stone oven by the edge of the square, where people still left crusts, candles, and tiny bundles of grain. And every now and then, when someone in the village falls ill with a sickness no doctor can name, you might see an old woman at dusk, flour on her hands, firelight in her eyes, baking something that smells faintly of rosemary and memory. Why they thought sins caused sores. It often began with a mark, a blemish, small and round, no larger than a coin, sometimes on the arm, sometimes on the chest, sometimes hidden, until it grew. People would stare, not openly, but in sidelong glances over bread, in the hush that followed a greeting, in the silence that stretched after someone coughed, because they believed the body could betray the soul, and when the body was wounded without cause, when a sore festered or a rash crept in the night, they didn't ask what you had touched, they asked what you had done. Sin had shape, it blistered on the skin, it festered in the joints, it burned in the eyes. If your hand had stolen, the fingers might swell. If your mouth had lied, the tongue might swell and blacken. If you had lusted, well, the sores would appear elsewhere. The body, they believed, remembered, even when the mind tried to forget. In some towns priests doubled as physicians. They read illness like scripture, each symptom a verse in the human book of judgment. They would hold up a candle to your rash and murmur the psalms, watching how the skin reacted, as if God would show them the truth. Was it punishment, or a test? Was the sore the mark of evil, or simply the evidence that evil had visited? Confession was a treatment. You would kneel, speak your sins, even the small ones, the unkind word, the stolen coin, the thought that lingered too long on someone else's wife. And when you rose, you might be handed a poultice made of ash and blessed oil, or a strip of linen with a cross stitched into it, to be worn beneath your tunic for 7 nights. If the sore healed, they said the soul had been forgiven. If it worsened, well, perhaps there were sins unspoken still. One man was said to have cured himself of plague by crawling for miles to the cathedral on his knees, his legs raw and bleeding, his eyes swollen from fever. He reached the steps, collapsed, and lived. They said it was because he confessed. They said the sores retreated once he admitted what he had done to his neighbor's daughter all those years ago. No one asked for details, but they remembered, and they whispered his name when their own limbs began to ache. Doctors of the time wrote of moral imbalance, of spiritual infection. Some believed the humors were stirred not by weather or diet, but by wrath, envy, lust. One noted that the blood grows hot with anger, and cools into rot if left unspoken. Another wrote, the sinner's skin will bear his transgression, if the conscience cannot. Women suffered most. Midwives accused of pride or stubbornness were blamed for stillbirths. Widows who asked too many questions found boils on their necks, and neighbors who no longer brought them bread. And the poor were always guilty of something. Their skin darkened in winter, and cracked in summer. They limped and trembled, and lost teeth, and no one wondered if it was hunger, only what they'd done to deserve it. The sores themselves were sometimes harmless, an irritation, a scrape gone bad, a scratch from a bramble in the wood, but meaning clung to them like smoke. If the sore spread, if it bled, or wept, or smelled of rot, the sinner had not repented. If it scabbed and faded, the village nodded quietly, and said the balance had been restored, no salve needed. Some healers refused this way of thinking. They saw illness for what it was, flesh, blood, time. But even they couldn't argue with the weight of belief. If someone believed their soul was rotting, their body often followed, and if a person believed themselves healed, if they truly wept, and confessed, and begged for mercy, sometimes the fever broke, sometimes the sores dried overnight. Even now, centuries later, historians debate whether those wounds were real, whether they were caused by guilt, by disease, or by something more mysterious. But in those cold stone towns, with their dim churches and crowded hearths, they didn't ask where the sore came from. They asked, what have you done, and whether you could forgive yourself before the rot set in too deep. The cold tools of the trade. They were kept in a wooden chest, not locked. There was no need, just shut tight, its lid bowed from age and weight, its iron hinges streaked with the dark fingerprints of 100 long-forgotten days. It sat in the back of the room, beneath the table, or behind a curtain, always close enough to reach, never close enough to look at without reason. Because no one opened that chest unless someone was bleeding, burning with fever, or too far gone to protest what came next. The tools inside weren't pretty. They were iron, mostly, forged by blacksmiths who also shod horses, who made plowshares and nails, and sometimes, on special request, a small set of human instruments. A scalpel, a cautery iron, a bone saw. None of them gleamed. None of them glistened in candlelight. They were cold, dull, pitted by years of heat and blood, hardened by the desperate hands of those who used them. The first tool was almost always the blade, short, straight, and simple. Not a surgeon's scalpel as we know it now, but a crude knife with a fat hilt, easy to grip, even when slippery. It opened abscesses, peeled away blackened skin, freed pus and poison from swollen flesh. It carved out rot. It sliced into arms and legs with practiced strokes. And when the flesh folded back, and the blood rushed out, there was only the fire to stop it, because that's where the second tool came in. The cautery iron, a bar of iron bent to fit the hand, its tip flattened or curved, sometimes shaped like a loop for delicate burns. It was heated in flame until red hot, then pressed to the open wound with a hiss and a stench that filled the room and clung to the clothes for days. The pain was white hot, blinding, but brief. Cautery sealed the bleeding. It killed what couldn't be cut out. And if the patient screamed, someone would hold them tighter. If they didn't, that was worse. There were saws, short-toothed, curved slightly, built not for precision, but for speed, because amputation couldn't take forever. The longer the blade hovered, the more blood was lost, the more pain bled into panic. They would tie the limb, one above, one below, a belt, a scarf, a rope, anything to slow the flood. Then they would begin. The saw made no apologies. It moved with weight and rhythm, one breath in, one stroke forward. Some surgeons worked so fast, they could remove a limb in less than a minute, but the healing would take months, if the patient lived. Next came the probes, thin metal rods, sometimes blunt, sometimes cruelly sharp, used to search for splinters of wood, shards of bone, arrowheads, used to follow wounds into the dark. If the wound was shallow, you'd know soon enough. If it wasn't, the probe would vanish up to the hilt before the patient even cried out. And if it touched something solid, something foreign, it would be followed by the forceps. The forceps, bent like a bird's beak, with handles that blistered the fingers when held too long. They were used to pull teeth, debris, the head of a stubborn baby caught in the wrong position. Forceps left bruises, sometimes fractures, sometimes worse, but they worked, and in a time when not working meant death, working was enough. The chest also held thread, not cotton, not silk, sometimes sinew, sometimes gut. It was coarse. It tugged through the skin like twine, through wet paper. It didn't vanish, didn't dissolve. It stayed in the flesh, left ridges and puckered seams. The needles were thick, curved like fishhooks, and dipped in vinegar between uses, when anyone remembered. But stitching a wound meant someone had lived long enough to be closed up again, and that too was rare. Scissors, clamps, pincers, spoons used to scrape infected tissue, each with a job, each with a weight in the hand that became familiar. A good healer could find the right one in the dark, could work without speaking, without pausing, while someone screamed beneath their breath. They didn't think of themselves as surgeons. There wasn't even a word for it, not really. They were cutters, cleaners, closers, and they knew that if you hesitated, the wound would spread, the blood would pour, the breath would stop. The tools weren't clean by modern standards. They were wiped, boiled if there was time, left by the fire to bake. Some were rinsed in ale, some in vinegar, some not at all. And yet again and again, those tools found their way back into hands, into wounds, into the space between death and chance. Today you can see them in museums, behind glass, labeled neatly: the barber surgeon's kit, C1350, medieval trepanation drill, amputation saw with horn handle. But the glass can't capture what it was like, the weight of the chest being opened, the smell of blood on iron, the sound of someone praying while their foot was removed. These were the cold tools of the trade, unforgiving, unfeeling, and utterly essential. A misdiagnosis that killed a king. He woke before dawn, feeling it first in his legs, a tightness, a warmth that shouldn't have been there, not from blankets or fire, but from within. The kind of warmth that whispered something was wrong. His servants were summoned, and when they peeled back the linen, they saw the swelling. His ankle, the colour of mulberries, his knee, rigid, his breath, short and sharp, like a blade drawn from a sheath. The court physician arrived half-dressed. He touched the king's pulse, frowned, sniffed the air. Then he smiled gently. "It is a minor inflammation," he said. "Too much wine, perhaps, or an evening draught." And so the king was left to rest. But it wasn't wine. It wasn't a passing cold, and the swelling didn't rest. By evening, it had doubled. The king was no longer speaking clearly. His words slurred, his eyes lost in the rafters. The court panicked. Messengers were sent by horse, riding through wind and sleet to reach healers, monks, surgeons. Still, no one knew. They offered leeches. They drained the humours. They opened his arms with knives, watching the blood drip into bowls, counting the drops like omens. But the fever climbed. One healer blamed melancholy. Said the king was suffering from an imbalance, his black bile too strong, his passions too weak. He prescribed a syrup made from boiled prunes, rosewater, and ash bark. The king drank it in silence. Another thought it was divine punishment. He urged confession. The king whispered a single sin no one ever repeated. But it didn't help. By the 4th day, his skin was yellow. By the 5th, his breathing rattled. By the 6th, the kingdom was quiet. The misdiagnosis was simple: a urinary blockage, a stone lodged too deep. It cut through the body from the inside, turning flesh to poison, and yet no one saw it. Not clearly, not quickly, because kings weren't just patients, they were symbols, too sacred for dissection, too holy to doubt. No one opened him to look, no one dared. Had he been a peasant, they might have tried. Had he been a merchant, a surgeon might have cut open his belly and found the stone before the fever took him. But kings were different. After his death, the court was silent. His body was dressed in fine silk, his face powdered to cover the bruising. The swelling was ignored, the cause of death left vague. God's will, they said, a divine summons. But among the servants, the rumors were different. They spoke of a heated gut, a scream in the night, a scent like rotting apples that never left the royal bedchamber. They spoke of blood that clotted too fast, and eyes that glazed over while the physician called it nothing. The physician was not punished. He continued his work, his notes bound in leather, his hands still steady, but he never again treated royalty. His name appeared less often in letters. His evenings were quiet. His eyes always tired. And in his private ledger, beneath all the neat scripts and lists of humours, there was one entry written in a shaking hand: "I mistook swelling for sin, and I let the crown die beneath me." Why you'd beg for a midwife instead? She didn't wear white. She had no official robes, no scrolls, no seal. Her fingers were rough. Her skirts were always dusted with hay, and she smelled faintly of fennel and smoke. But in the moment when your wife began to scream, when your sister doubled over clutching her belly, when your neighbor's daughter slipped into fevered silence, you sent for her, you begged for her, you begged for the midwife. Because if anyone could pull a child from the arms of death, or soothe a mother's breath when it came in jagged sobs, or lay their hands on a body, shaking from within, and whisper just the right word at just the right time, it was her. Doctors were for the rich, surgeons for the wounded, priests for the dying, but midwives were for life. They knew the body like the back of their hands, not through drawings in books or university lectures, but through blood, through hours spent at bedsides lit by candle and moon, through breech births and silent stillbirths, through joy that came screaming, and grief that arrived without breath. They learned not by theory, but by survival. The village midwife didn't need your approval. She had already helped deliver half the people in town. She'd been there when your cousin was born with the cord wrapped twice around her neck. She'd stopped the bleeding when your mother nearly died, after her 7th child. She'd shown your older sister how to nurse with cracked bleeding skin and eyes too tired to open. She was knowledge with a heartbeat, and you trusted her, even if you didn't say it aloud. She carried a satchel of simple things: a small knife, twine, linen squares, honey, herbs wrapped in waxed cloth, and sometimes a carved charm tucked into the folds of her shawl, just in case. There was no anesthesia, no epidural, no antiseptic wash, but her hands were steady, her voice soft, her presence enough to calm the sharpest edge of fear. When the mother's eyes rolled back, the midwife slapped her gently. When the father shook with panic, the midwife shoved him out. She took control of chaos, not with rank, but with rhythm, with repetition, with ritual. Doctors, when they bothered to attend births at all, often made things worse. They'd arrive too late, issue cold commands, reach for forceps with unfamiliar hands. They might cut too soon, or not at all, or declare the mother lost just as the midwife would have known to change the mother's position, or tilt her hips or whisper the name of a saint. No book remembered. Doctors delivered theories, midwives delivered babies. She knew the signs others missed, the way a woman's fingernails went pale an hour before the bleeding started, the way the baby's heartbeat slowed just before the cord pulled taut. She had instincts honed by years and memories buried deep of the ones she couldn't save. She remembered every one of them. She didn't speak their names, but when she lit her fire at night, she'd sometimes murmur old prayers just loud enough for no one to hear. There were whispers, of course, that midwives used charms, that they spoke to the moon, that they carried salt in their apron pockets to ward off spirits, that some of them knew when a baby would be born with the veil, a caul over its face, marking it for prophecy, or madness, or both. But even those who whispered feared more what might happen without her, because when a midwife was gone, when she fell ill, or left, or died, the births became colder, harder, quieter. More babies were still, more mothers bled too long, and then people remembered why they'd once brought her bread on quiet mornings without saying why. In plague years the midwife did not run. She stayed, wrapped her mouth in damp cloth, bathed her hands in ash and vinegar, cut the cord, wrapped the child, and buried the mother, all in the same day. Sometimes she'd help deliver 6 children in a week, and lose 5. Sometimes she'd deliver a single baby, and hold it close to her chest long after the crying stopped, and then she'd go back to her cottage, lay down on the cold straw floor, and stare at the ceiling until dawn. Because midwives carried more than satchels, they carried stories, and guilt, and gratitude too vast to explain, and still, in courtrooms and pulpits, some men called them dangerous, too much power, too much knowledge. They were accused of witchcraft, imprisoned for poor outcomes, burned for reasons no one understood. But the people in the village, they remembered whose hands brought them into the world, whose hands tied the cord, rubbed the infant's back, and whispered, "It's done, you're here, you're safe." So when the time came again, when the waters broke and the breath came short, and the pain narrowed into fire, they didn't call for the priest, they didn't fetch the doctor, they didn't wait for permission, they ran for the midwife, and they begged. The doctor who tried spells, he didn't start with spells. He started with bandages, made from boiled linen soaked in brine. He started with poultices, wild sage, yarrow root, mashed into a coarse pulp and tied with string. He started like all doctors were meant to, with the science of the day, bleeding, balancing, binding. He read the great texts. He studied Galen, Hippocrates. He owned a surgical knife, imported from Italy, and a collection of dried herbs labeled in Latin. He kept careful records, knew the color of pus that meant infection, and the sound of lungs just before they drowned. But it wasn't enough, because sometimes the wound wouldn't close, sometimes the fever wouldn't break, sometimes the patient, despite every treatment, every prayer, just kept dying. And after enough of that, even a learned man starts to ask the old questions. He found his first spell in a market stall, between a basket of rotten apples and a woman selling strips of rabbit fur as remedies for toothache. It was a scrap of vellum, curled at the edges, written in a hand that slanted violently to the left. The ink was red, not from pigment, from blood. The seller didn't say much, just tapped the corner of the page and muttered, "Try it on someone you're ready to lose." He bought it anyway. The spell wasn't long. It began with a phrase in a language he didn't know, not Latin, not Greek, something older, clumsier. Then an instruction, burn the name of the illness, feed the smoke to the patient. He laughed the first time, almost threw it away, but that night his apprentice died in her sleep, fevered, eyes wide open, a thread of blood at her lip that hadn't been there before. And the next morning, he began to take the spell more seriously. His second spell came from a priest, not an official one, a defrocked man who lived alone near the woods, whose sermons had been replaced by carvings and murmurs in candlelight. They met in secret, exchanged few words. The priest gave him a charm, a hollow bone, sealed with wax, filled with something that rattled when shaken but was never opened. Hang it near their bed, the priest said, but only if they're ready to stay. That night, the doctor treated a boy with a fever so high he could hear colors. The boy slept beneath the charm. and woke. The doctor started to believe. He never abandoned medicine. He still drained wounds, set bones, bled the afflicted. But when the bleeding failed, he added a whisper. When the herbs did nothing, he traced symbols in the air. When a patient seized and shook, he pressed a stone warmed by fire against the soles of their feet and muttered the syllables he'd once laughed at. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. But when it did, the recovery was sharp, strange, sudden. Eyes cleared, skin cooled, voices steadied, and people began to talk. Some praised him, said he had learned things the church had forgotten, said he had one foot in this world, and the other somewhere deeper. Some feared him, called him unnatural, said his cures came at a price no one could see. A few sent for him in secret, rich women, lords with dying sons, monks who'd lost their faith but not their sickness. They offered gold, he never took it. He said magic didn't like being bought. One day, a woman brought her husband, a merchant with boils on his back and a cough that spat blood. The doctor opened his box, laid out the bandages, the herbs, the knife, but the woman shook her head. No, the other things. The quiet ones. He hesitated, then nodded. He gave the man water that had been whispered over for 7 nights. He burned 3 strands of his own hair and placed the ashes beneath the pillow. He sat by the fire and recited not words, but rhythm, a sound with no name, just a shape. By dawn, the merchant was better, and by dusk, the doctor had more requests than he could answer. He never claimed to be a sorcerer, never wore robes, never took an apprentice. He kept his spells on scraps, hidden inside hollowed books. He burned the ones that failed. He memorized the ones that worked, and when people asked how a man of learning had come to this, he only said, "There are things the knife cannot reach." So I reached further. Suffering for science, sort of. He was not the first to wonder what lay just beneath the skin, but he was one of the few foolish or brave enough to try and find out while the patient was still alive. He called it investigation. Others called it madness. And still, they came to him. Because when the monks gave only prayers, and the herbalist shook her head, and the barber whispered, "There's nothing more to do," he still offered something more. Not comfort, not peace, but curiosity, a chance, however slim, to learn something from suffering. He kept a ledger. Its pages were stiff, stained, warped from steam and sweat, each one marked with a name, or sometimes just boy, age 11, or woman, found at river's edge. There were drawings in the margins, not beautiful ones. Crude outlines of intestines, lungs opened like bellows, a liver with mottling, so strange he'd copied it twice. Most of what he knew was from pain. The town whispered about his workshop. It smelled of vinegar and blood, even on good days. He boiled his instruments in brass kettles. He sharpened them with a whetstone, while reciting old medical chants, learned from a friar who'd once worked in Spain. He lit tallow candles, burned rosemary to mask the stench, and sometimes wore a linen mask soaked in piss and ash, believing it would guard him from invisible illness. Sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't, but he was rarely afraid of dying, only of not knowing why someone else had. His patients didn't volunteer. Not exactly. Most of them arrived because no one else would take them, because they were already dying, because their families had run out of coin, or out of prayers, or out of time. He told them the truth. "I won't promise comfort, I won't promise a cure, but I will do everything I can to understand what's wrong." Sometimes they agreed. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they just stopped protesting. One boy came in with a jaw so swollen he couldn't eat, couldn't speak. His breath smelled of rot. The doctor held him down, cut into the skin below the ear, and waited. The pus erupted in a spray so foul the candle beside the bed gutted out. But the boy lived. And now in the ledger, next to boy age 9, there's a note, abscess of unknown gland, possibly tooth, possibly curse. The doctor never claimed to be certain, only curious. Another time, a woman arrived whose belly had swelled for weeks. She hadn't bled in over a month, but no baby stirred within her. He pressed her abdomen, listened to her breath, sliced her open gently, and found a knot of tissue, purple and pulsing, twisting around itself. He'd never seen anything like it. He described it in the ledger as a flower made of meat. She died the next morning. He wept, but he drew it anyway. His methods were not kind. He used stones to weigh down limbs during spasms. He used burning spoons to test nerve reaction. He once filled a man's ear with honey to see if it softened an infection he believed had burrowed into the skull. The man screamed, then smiled, then died in his sleep. One of his patients returned, years later, a girl he'd cut open along the ribs to drain water from her lungs. He hadn't expected her to live. She had. She brought him bread, asked him if the scar meant she'd never marry. He said, "Anyone who minds it isn't worth your time." She smiled and left. He didn't write her name in the book. He just wrote, "Survived," smiled. But there were failures, and they weighed more heavily. The boy whose legs he broke to reset, but who never walked again. The man whose skull he opened with a hand drill, believing he could relieve the demons inside. He made it through the procedure, then wandered into the woods the next night and was never seen again. He recorded these too, in ink, not blood, in pages wrinkled by tears he didn't admit. People asked him if what he did was truly science. He'd shrug. "It's not yet, but it might be." He believed that someday someone would read his ledgers, study his mistakes, his sketches, his guesses, and do better. Not because they were braver, but because they didn't have to start in the dark. He died quietly, at home, in the room that had held screams, candles, steam. He left behind 12 ledgers, 3 sets of knives, a single locked box no one could open. His grave was unmarked. The town didn't know what to make of him, still doesn't. But once in a while, when someone recovers from a strange fever or survives a surgery they shouldn't, a very old doctor somewhere whispers, "He suffered, so we wouldn't have to." Anatomy. According to Chickens, the classroom was not a classroom. It was a barn, or a cellar, or the back room of an apothecary's shop that always smelled of mold and lavender. There were no windows, only candles. Their wax dripped steadily, like time, like blood, and on the table, there was not a human body. There was a chicken. Feathers half plucked, eyes dull, wings stiff with rigor. Its neck lolled to the side as the students leaned in with ink-stained fingers, quills behind their ears, and a mixture of excitement and dread in their throats. Because today they would learn how a body worked, by studying something that was not a person, but was close enough. Dissection was rare. Too rare. Human cadavers were almost impossible to come by. It was illegal. It was immoral. It was dangerous. Only a handful of universities in all of Europe were allowed to perform human dissections, and only under strict supervision. The bodies came from the gallows, criminals whose deaths made their flesh forfeit. Even then, the dissection had to happen fast. The decay began almost immediately, and the smell, they said, it stayed in your clothes for days. So most students, most would-be physicians, practiced instead on animals, and most often, on chickens. They laid the bird out like a king, its breast exposed, limbs splayed and pinned. The instructor dipped a blade in vinegar, and began. He did not explain much. That came later, when they'd seen it for themselves. The students leaned in closer. He parted the skin with a single stroke. There beneath the surface, a membrane they called the silver veil. They watched it peel back, watched the muscles quiver, watched the small lungs and the delicate heart, still warm, sometimes still beating, if the bird had only just died. The instructor spoke of humours, of bile and phlegm and blood and blackness. He pointed to parts that weren't visible, but were supposed to be there. The seat of courage, the centre of melancholy, the furnace of digestion. He held up the intestines like a rosary, showed them how they looped and folded and knotted. "Here is the path of sin," he said once, "when it refuses to leave the body." The students nodded. Some sketched what they saw, some wrote the words, liver, gall, spirit, steam. But some students weren't satisfied. They wanted to know what came next. What happened when flesh failed? What happened when the lungs filled with fluid and the heart stopped mid-beat? So they practiced. They cut deeper. Some took chickens home, dead or alive, to study in secret. They drew diagrams, cut open eggs, measured yolk and albumin, like alchemists searching for the soul. One student claimed he'd found a nerve that made the wing flap after death. Another believed the gizzard was the body's second brain. They were wrong mostly. But their wrongness was the beginning of understanding. Of course, not everyone approved. There were whispers that poking around inside birds invited the devil, that animals were not meant to be opened. That knowledge had a cost no one could yet measure. Some towns banned the practice. Some students were caught with feathers in their satchels and fined for disturbing the peace. One instructor was thrown in a well, but still they continued, in barns and kitchens and corners of monasteries where the abbot pretended not to see. Eventually, some students got their wish. A man died, alone, penniless, his body unclaimed, and the local surgeon was called in before the grave was dug. They gathered around the table, the same table where chickens had lain 100 times before. But this time, there were no feathers, no beak, no soft warm heart the size of a walnut. This time, there was a man. The students froze, because what they saw was not the same. The muscles were thicker, the organs heavier, the blood darker. They were reminded, suddenly, painfully, that chickens were not people, that all they had learned was not enough. And yet, they understood more than they would have, had they never practiced, had they never watched a bird's body fail, had they never wondered what lay just beneath the surface. So they kept their diagrams, their notes, their little jars of feathers and twisted bones. They remembered the warmth of the bird's heart, how it pulsed in their fingers, how it stopped, and how silence had taught them more than any book ever could. The man who drank puss. He wasn't the first to think it, but he might have been the first to say it aloud. If it came from the body, and the body survives, then surely there's something healing in it. Most laughed. Some scoffed. A few nodded silently, uncertain whether he was a fool, a visionary, or both. He had no formal title, no degree from Paris or Salerno, but he had a reputation, the kind earned not through letters or lineage, but through unflinching willingness to try what no one else dared, and try he did. His house was always warm, not from fire, but from the feverish breath of the desperate. He treated the poor, the abandoned, the ones whose wounds festered too long, whose ulcers smelled of wet earth and metal, whose bodies leaked from places that shouldn't leak. And when they came to him, oozing, trembling, stinking of slow rot, he didn't recoil. He leaned in. He believed puss was holy, not in the divine sense, but in the biological. To him puss was the body fighting back, an army of white blood. He called it, though he didn't yet know the word for cell, he called it living sap, and thought it deserved respect. Study, tasting even. His theory was simple. If puss was the evidence of recovery, then its essence might strengthen others, transfer the fight, carry the cure. So one morning, quietly, he collected it. Not from just anyone. From a boy 12 years old, surviving a horrible leg wound that should have killed him. The flesh had turned black at the edges. But from the center came thick, yellow-white matter, sweet-smelling, he said. In a strange, milky way, he scooped it with a spoon, held it to the candlelight, and drank. What followed was not death, nor sickness. Only a mild ache in the gut, and a peculiar sense of clarity. He repeated the ritual, this time from a different patient, an old man with sores behind the ears. Again he lived. Then a girl with lung infection. Then a merchant with tooth rot. He catalogued the source of each spoonful, noted the consistency, the scent, the taste. Some were bitter, some bland. One, he claimed, tasted of old honey and leather. He began to publish, in scraps, not bound books, but folded papers passed to wandering healers, scribes, friars, anyone who might read, concerning the nature of healing matter, the potency of festering liquor, on ingesting the self's wounds in another, each more unsettling than the last. Word spread, slowly at first, then quickly. Some called him a madman, others, a prophet. A few curious and unmoored from decency, began their own tastings. They wrote letters, notes scribbled in grease and spit, flesh of the thigh, warm, mild effect. From throat boil, induced vomiting, but no fever. It became a kind of grotesque secret society, men with spoons and scalpels, more interested in fermentation of the human body than in prayer. But there were failures, horrors. A monk in Flanders tried puss from a plague victim. He lasted 6 hours. Another drank from a man with blue-tinged phlegm and twitching fingers. He screamed for 2 days, then lost the ability to walk. The original man, the one who started it all, continued undeterred. He adjusted his rules. No material from the dead. No signs of trembling. Only living wounds. Only active healing. He believed he was sipping immunity. The body's wisdom, drawn into the mouth. Eventually someone came to stop him. Not with fire, not with law, but with quiet concern. A woman, his former apprentice, now a respected healer in another town. She found his home full of jars, some labeled, some not, a few with congealed lids, others sealed with wax and prayers written backward. She asked him gently, "Have you considered that the cure might also be the illness?" He didn't answer. He pointed instead to a stack of parchment, all filled with names, dates, sicknesses treated, recoveries recorded. He said they lived. I lived. What else matters? No one knows how he died. Some say he choked on a spoonful, from a soldier fresh from a battlefield wound. Some say he stopped eating entirely, refusing all but what the body offered. Others say he vanished, taking his jars with him, wandering from village to village, seeking the perfect infection to sip. His papers survived, scattered, torn, mocked, but some scholars, quiet ones, still study the notes. Not for method, but for madness, and for the tiny undeniable hints that beneath the horror was a question no one had answered. Could the body's sickness ever contain its own cure? When a dream gave you a cure, she hadn't slept in days, not properly, not fully, just snatches of half-consciousness stolen between prayers and screams. Her daughter lay fevered in the next room, her skin hot as a hearthstone, her lips cracked, her eyes flickering behind swollen lids. She hadn't spoken in 2 days, hadn't eaten in 3. The village healer had come and gone, twice, left behind bundles of herbs, instructions for poultices, and the familiar final warning: if the fever climbs again, you must prepare. But that night, as the woman sat beside the child's bed, wiping her brow with damp cloths and whispering old songs with cracked lips, something shifted. Her own eyes drooped, her fingers went slack, and suddenly, she was no longer sitting in the room. She stood in a forest she'd never seen. The trees were tall, but the light between them was gentle, blue like twilight through glass. The leaves whispered, but there was no wind, and in the center of the forest, a figure stood, not a person, not quite, but something shaped like a person, draped in fabric that moved like smoke. Its voice came not through sound, but through presence, like remembering something before it happens. It said only this: dig where the 3 stones meet, boil the root, speak her name into the steam. Then the light flared, and she woke. The fire had gone out, the cloth in her hand was dry, the girl's breath was shallow, almost gone. The mother didn't question. She threw on her shawl, took a lantern, and stepped into the night. The stones weren't far, 3 flat boulders, half buried behind the old chapel, where children weren't allowed to play. No one knew who had placed them, but they had been there longer than memory. She knelt between them, fingers numb with cold, dug with her bare hands. The dirt was soft, wet, and there, a root, twisted, pale. It smelled faintly of rot and flowers. She didn't hesitate. She ran home, boiled water, dropped the root in, watched the water turn cloudy, then golden, then red. She carried the pot to her daughter's bedside, let the steam rise over the child's face, and spoke, "Mirror." Just once. The girl inhaled, coughed, opened her eyes. She told no one for days, not the priest, not the healer, not her neighbors, who noticed the child walking again 2 mornings later, asking for milk and bread. But the story came out, because stories always do, and soon, others began dreaming. A man with a wasting cough dreamed of a white fish leaping from a well behind his house. He followed the dream, ate the fish raw. The cough vanished. A shepherd saw, in sleep, an owl drinking from a cracked bowl. He found the bowl. It held rainwater turned green. He drank it. The pain in his joints faded. A widow mourning too long dreamed of lying in her husband's grave, only to be pulled upward by vines of ivy. She went to his grave, tied ivy around her wrists, slept beneath the sky. She woke laughing. The dreams weren't always cures. Some led nowhere. Some brought illness. A few brought madness. One boy claimed he saw a red snake wrapping around his spine. He painted it on his back with crushed berries, refused to wash it off. He died a week later, smiling. Another woman dreamed of fire under her tongue. She swallowed coals. She lived, but never spoke again. Still the stories grew, not just in the village, but in neighboring towns. Travelers came not for herbs, but for sleep. They built special beds, lined with moss or stone or feathers, depending on the dreamer's wish. They fasted before sleeping, burned certain woods, whispered the names of illnesses into the dark, hoping for an answer in return. Dreaming became a ritual, a science of shadows. The church at first called it heresy, said healing came from God, not from sleep. But when the bishop's sister fell ill, and no physician helped, he lay beside her bed and prayed for a dream. He awoke with a name on his lips, a flower he hadn't thought of in years. It grew only on the cliffs by the coast. He sent a servant to find it. She lived, and the church went quiet. In time those who dreamed often came to be called the hollow-eyed, not because they were sick, but because they never quite looked awake. Their eyes carried places no one else had seen, forest paths that didn't exist, fires that spoke, faces made of smoke and salt. Some stopped speaking entirely, others spoke only in riddles, but they always knew what route to use, which herb to burn, where to press, when to wait. They weren't doctors, they weren't witches, they were something in between, and people trusted them, even when they shouldn't. No one ever found out what lay beyond the forest in the dream, only that it was warm and dark, and full of answers that never made sense until they were tried. It wasn't safe, but neither was medicine, and so the people kept sleeping, not to escape, but to search, to reach a world where the cure came not from study or pain, but from silence, shadows, and the whisper of a name. The final visit. He arrived without a knock, just a shadow at the threshold, draped in the kind of silence that made the air feel heavier. The healer looked up from her stool, half asleep beside the fire, a mortar of crushed fennel in her lap. The man didn't speak. He didn't need to. She knew who he was. Not a stranger, not a messenger, not even death. No, he was the last kind of visitor a healer meets. The one who doesn't need help, but comes to mark an ending. He stepped inside. The room was simple. Packed dirt floor, a shelf of dried herbs, labeled in a faded hand. A cot where 24 had died, and nearly as many had walked away. The man looked around, as though inventorying a life. He picked up a small jar of rose oil, sniffed it, nodded. "You still use this?" he asked, finally. "Sometimes," she said, "for grief." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He wasn't a ghost, but he belonged to that same borderland between memory and flesh. He had once been her teacher. Decades ago, when she was barely tall enough to reach the apothecary shelf, he had shown her how to bind wounds with boiled flax, how to listen to a fever's rhythm, how to coax the pulse into telling its secrets. He'd left before she was grown. No one knew where, only that he had gone to study deeper things. She poured 2 cups of broth. He didn't drink his. "I came," he said, "because the time for questions is almost over." She set her cup down. He reached into his satchel, pulled out a book wrapped in black cloth, not leather, not cloth, even. Something older, something tanned and oiled into silence. He unwrapped it, set it on the table between them. She didn't touch it, didn't need to. The pages whispered, not in sound, but in scent. Dust, salt, vinegar, sap, soot, a record of things not written in language, but in memory. He opened the book to the center. There, drawn with excruciating care, was a diagram of a man's chest. Not the way a scholar would draw it, but the way a dreamer would remember it. Curved lines spiraling from the lungs, symbols where the heart should be. A single black feather glued to the margin. "What is this?" she asked. "Everything we guessed," he replied, "and what we were afraid to guess." He told her of his years away, the forest where he drank water that reflected nothing, the woman with no tongue, who taught him how to pull sickness through the soles of the feet, the cave of jars, hundreds of them, each labeled with a name, a date, a single drop of fluid, sealed forever. The monastery where monks chanted, not in Latin, but in the echoes of dying breaths. And finally, the stone house with no windows where he lived alone for 7 winters, recording what he had seen in ink made of soot and spit. This book was the only thing he had brought back. He opened another page, a drawing of a plant. No roots, just thorns and leaves folded like hands in prayer. She'd seen it before, once. It had grown near a grave, only in winter. The petals oozed a red sap when crushed. "I called it Saint's Mercy," she said. He nodded. "In the east they call it Fire's Womb. In the south, Mother's Grief." She blinked. "It kills if eaten raw, but if you boil it with the skin of a white apple, it stills the heartbeat just long enough to pull someone back." They sat in silence. He handed her the book. "Finish it," he said. She stared at him. "What do you mean?" "I've written what I could, but there's more. You've seen it. In dreams, in blood, in the way bones settle after death." She looked at the pages, saw sketches that moved when her eyes unfocused, recipes that changed depending on the time of day, and then her own handwriting. On a page she hadn't turned yet. She touched it. The ink was warm. He stood, walked to the door, paused. "You'll know when the last page comes," he said. "And when it does, don't try to write an ending. Just close it." She wanted to ask more, but he was already gone. That night, she dreamed of her childhood village. Empty, but not abandoned. Each house breathing, as though waiting. She walked the main road, came to the well. Inside it, not water, not bones, but the book, open and glowing with lines that looked like veins, pulsing softly. She reached in, touched it, and awoke. In the morning, the fire was out, the broth was cold, the book was open on her lap. She picked up her quill and began to write the next chapter, not in words, but in what she had seen. The way a fever rises like a tide, the song that keeps a wound from festering, the breath between dying and not dying, and one line on the final page she hadn't yet reached, waiting to be written. He was never the last visitor, only the final one I remembered. Why nobody trusted doctors. The knock always came late, when the candles had burned too low to see properly, when the children had quieted, when the neighbors were asleep, or pretending to be, and it never sounded like a knock, more like a scrape, a soft pressure, a weight at the door you could feel more than hear. That's when people knew a doctor had come. To be clear, it wasn't that people didn't want help. They did, they begged for it. But trust, that was another matter. Because in the Middle Ages, a doctor was rarely the one who healed you. More often, he was the one who arrived when it was already too late. He didn't bring comfort. He didn't bring kindness. He brought knives and a basin for your blood. People learned to recognize the signs. When a stranger came wearing a long coat, not for warmth, but to protect against the rot. When he carried a stick, not for walking, but to lift your tongue, poke your swelling, tap your abdomen and nod. Always the nod. Slow. Final. As if sealing your fate. And then, always the same words. We must act. No one ever felt better after that. Acting meant cutting, burning, draining. It meant being held down by your neighbors while your limbs were tied, your skin opened, your veins emptied in the name of balance. Too much heat, they'd say. Or, too much blood. Or the black bile has taken root, so they would make you bleed until your vision blurred, until your lips went dry, until your breath came hollow. And if you survived, they said you were lucky. But most didn't. Whispers filled the gaps. Did you hear? They called the doctor. Oh, then it's over. I'd rather die at home than under his hands. My cousin walked into that man's tent and never came out. Mothers warned their children. If you lie, if you sneak sweets, if you misbehave, a doctor will come for you. And so doctors became something darker. Not just healers, not even men, but figures cloaked in red-stained linen, faces hidden behind scarves soaked in vinegar, eyes narrowed by knowledge no one wanted. Some doctors didn't help their case. A few turned their work into spectacle. In public squares, they'd open boils, show how much pus could drain from a wound, explain the virtues of maggots and mud. They lectured as they cut, held up jars of urine, squinted at the color, proclaimed illness by shade and scent alone. They never apologized, never paused, just shook their heads and said, "It is the body, it does what it does," and walked away. Others made promises they couldn't keep. Miracle powders, waters blessed by saints, charms written on lambskin that crumbled in the heat. People paid in coin, or chickens, or candles. Some gave up their tools, some, their last blanket. In return, they got little, sometimes a potion that made them vomit, sometimes a paste that smelled of horse sweat and lavender, and when the illness remained, the doctor was already gone. On to the next town, the next house, the next hopeful fool, and then there were the quiet ones. The doctors who didn't lie, but didn't speak either. They sat by your bed, listened, laid cool hands on your chest, closed your eyes gently when your breath stopped. People didn't hate them, but they feared them even more, because these were the ones you called only when you had no other choice. When the fever didn't break, when the swelling didn't stop, when the prayers had grown stale, then, and only then did you send for the silent doctor, the one who came like fog, left like a shadow, and never looked back. Still some tried to rebuild the trust. A few opened small rooms in their homes, inviting patients inside like guests. They used gentler words, smiled, lit incense. They taught about herbs, how willow bark could ease pain, how mint could soothe the stomach, how garlic fought rot. They wrapped wounds slowly, warmed their hands before touching a patient's skin. But the memory of the others lingered. It's hard to trust the hand that looks so much like the one that hurt your mother, the one that drained your brother, the one that said, "This is all we can do." So people turned to midwives, to herbalists, to monks with salves and stories, to charms tied with red thread, and prayers carved into candles, because at least they offered kindness, at least they sat beside you through the long nights, at least they didn't arrive only when the bleeding was about to begin. Even centuries later, in villages where no doctors had visited for decades, children would grow still when someone mentioned the word, "A doctor's coming," and someone would whisper, half laughing, half afraid, "Better dig the grave now." The deathbed confession. It began with a cough, small, insignificant, the kind of sound one makes when dust settles in the throat, or when old age begins to whisper in the lungs. But it didn't go away. Not the next day, not the day after. By the end of the week he was coughing up something heavier, not blood, not bile, but a thick rust-colored mucus that clung to his lips, and left the air around him sharp and metallic. He knew what it meant, not because he feared death, but because he had seen it before, in hundreds of others. He had once been the man who arrived when the cough became a death sentence. He had been a doctor, not the kind with a university degree, or a crest sewn into his robe, but the kind people called in desperation, the kind who kept his tools wrapped in waxed cloth and whispered to his herbs as he ground them. He had treated wounds, drained boils, bled fevers. He had also misjudged swelling, burned flesh that could have healed, pushed needles too far, and told too many mothers that their children would be fine when he knew they wouldn't. He didn't see himself as a monster. He was doing what he'd been taught, what others had done to him, what the books said to do. Still he remembered the eyes, the ones that stayed open after the body went still, the ones that stared up in fear as the blade came close, the ones that watched him walk away without saying goodbye. He had retired young, not because he wanted to, but because the weight became too heavy. He stopped answering calls, moved far from the cities, to a quiet village with no roads wide enough for wagons. There he planted herbs that had no names in Latin, spoke little, ate less. He told people he had once been a scholar, that his limp came from an old accident, that the satchel of rolled parchment by his bedside was poetry, not patient records, and for a while he believed the lie himself, until the cough, until the dreams. In the nights he saw them, not the dead, but the nearly dead, the ones who had suffered under his hand, the ones he had tried to save, but had made worse, the boy whose lungs he had opened with a reed, believing it would let him breathe again. He had died screaming, the woman whose blood he drained day after day, until she slipped into stillness, whiter than the sheets that wrapped her, the old priest who had begged for more time. He had given him laudanum instead. Their faces returned to him, not angry, not vengeful, just waiting, as though they expected him to finally say the thing he had never said. And so, one morning, when the pain in his chest made it hard to stand, he sent a boy to fetch the scribe. The villagers were surprised. He'd never asked for anything, not company, not bread, certainly not ink, but they sent for her. She came after sunset. The scribe was a quiet woman, with careful hands and eyes that had seen their share of final words. She didn't ask why he wanted to speak. She simply unrolled her parchment, dipped her pen, and nodded once. He began. It started with names, people she didn't know, places she had never seen. He told her about the marketplace in Tournai, where he had treated a boy who collapsed from heat. He had packed the child in ice and vinegar. The boy never woke up. He spoke of the nobleman, who insisted he be bled weekly to maintain his balance. He had bled him every Sunday, even when the man's lips turned blue. He confessed that once in a hospital outside Bruges, he had reused a lancet, because the others had rusted. 3 people died from infection that week. He had told no one. He had burned the blade in secret. The scribe wrote it all, word for word, her face unreadable. She didn't flinch at the worst parts, not when he described lancing a child's tongue to release the fever, not when he recalled placing leeches near a woman's eyes to draw out the headache, not even when he admitted that more than once he had given up on a patient before trying everything, because he was tired, because he wanted to sleep, because he thought it wouldn't matter. But it did, he whispered. It always mattered. He paused often, to breathe, to drink, to cry, not loud tears, not dramatic, just the kind that slipped from the corner of the eye, forgotten until they landed on parchment. When he could speak no more, he closed his eyes. She asked only one question: "What should I do with this?" He didn't answer at first, then softly, "Let it be read, somewhere, by someone who still thinks we always meant well." He died before sunrise, peacefully, alone, no herbs, no chants, no tools, only the faint smell of ink and crushed time in the air. The villagers found the scroll the next morning. They didn't burn it. They passed it to the midwife, who passed it to the priest, who passed it to a wandering scholar with a heavy satchel and a curious mind. And over the years it traveled, copied, whispered, studied in quiet corners of candlelit libraries. The confession of the nameless doctor. Some said it proved the cruelty of medicine. Others said it showed its sorrow. A few called it cowardice, words spilled too late to matter. But one passage stayed with everyone who read it. We learned by failing. We healed by hurting. We entered homes not with miracles, but with guesses dressed as cures. And too often we were wrong. People still distrust doctors even now, not because of what they do today, but because of what was done long ago. The hands that didn't listen, the knives that came too quickly, the eyes that looked through you instead of at you. And somewhere, in a library no one visits, a brittle scroll waits, not to accuse, not to explain, but to remind that healing was once a profession of shadows, and that even now those shadows remain. The loneliest profession in history. They were always alone, even in a crowded room, even surrounded by candles and crying and incense and steam. A doctor stood apart, not out of arrogance, not out of pride, but because no one wanted to stand too close to the one who knew what dying looked like up close. The healer, the physician, the leech, the plague walker, call them what you will. They walked a strange road, too educated for the villagers, too untrustworthy for the priests, too imprecise for the philosophers, too superstitious for the scholars. They lived between worlds, and more than anyone, they knew just how fragile that space could be. When they entered a home, people fell quiet. When they touched a child's forehead, the room held its breath. And when they spoke, when they finally spoke, it was often to say what no one wanted to hear. Sometimes they told the truth. Sometimes they lied gently, and sometimes they said nothing at all. Because sometimes there were no words left to wrap around death that hadn't already grown cold. They didn't have villages of their own. Not really. Even if they stayed in one place, they were always slightly outside it. The house at the end of the lane. The one with the garden no one touched. The windows always open, even in winter, so the air could move the illness away. They weren't invited to weddings, rarely to births, always to funerals. Some of them grew bitter, some grew silent, some wrote long, rambling letters no one ever read, filled with sketches of spleens and lists of symptoms and dreams that wouldn't go away. And yet people needed them, more than they admitted, more than they liked. Because when the blood came, when the belly swelled, when the child cried without end, when the priest could offer only comfort, the doctor was the only one who might still try something, even if it didn't work, even if it made things worse, even if it made them hated afterward. They came anyway, always. Some carried too much with them, not in their bags, in their minds. The memories of patients they couldn't save, the screams they couldn't forget, the final moments that played on loop, quiet and vivid behind closed eyes. There was no one to talk to, no one who understood, not really. The villagers didn't want the details. The other doctors pretended they had no regrets, and so they carried it alone, year after year, town after town, until their hands began to shake, or they forgot which herb cured which cough, or the guilt caught up in the night. When the dreams returned and the faces gathered around the bed, not accusing, just waiting. A few became famous, most didn't. A few wrote books that students copied for generations. Most left no name at all, just stains on linen, just half-empty jars, just whispers passed from healer to apprentice, like the dying echo of an old song. And when they finally died, their bodies were sometimes buried outside the church walls, just in case. Because you never knew what passed through the hands of someone who had seen so much suffering. It was a lonely profession. The loneliest, but not because they were unloved. Not entirely, because love, when it came in odd shapes. A bowl left on the doorstep, a whispered thanks in a back alley, a child who reached for their hand in the dark because no one else would. Love came quietly, and without witnesses, and that perhaps was enough. The world moved on. Doctors changed, so did tools and books and names for the same old pain, but the loneliness stayed. You can still see it now, in the tired eyes of someone who's just come from telling a family they've done everything they could. In the silence of a room where a life just ended, and someone has to say it aloud. In the gentle way a hand checks a pulse, knowing what it might not find. Not everyone can walk into rooms full of grief. Not everyone can stand beside a bed when hope has already slipped out the window. Not everyone can carry the weight of every failed cure, every trembling breath, every terrible well-meant guess. But someone has to, and for most of history that someone did it alone. They weren't saints, they weren't monsters, they were human, exhausted, flawed, sometimes brilliant, sometimes broken, but always present. And maybe that's all we ever asked of them, not to save us, not to fix us, but to be there when it mattered most, even when we couldn't say thank you, even when we didn't trust them, even when they left without a word, and faded quietly from the world like a shadow at the end of a long hallway.